At the launch party for Sergeant Pepper, John was high, and the journalist Ray Coleman, who later wrote a biography of him, was seriously worried about his health when he met him that night. Not only was John clearly drugged, he was smoking and drinking heavily, and looked haggard, old, and ill. His eyes were glazed and his speech was slurred. Ray had mentioned his concern to Brian, who had replied, "Don't worry, he's a survivor." I, too, was worried about John's health. The drugs had ruined his appetite, and he did indeed look terrible. I feared he might kill himself. John had always had the potential to self-destruct, and now he seemed hell-bent on fulfilling it. I found it hard to understand his attraction to drugs. Was it a way of blotting out the pain of his childhood? It seemed to me that initially success had done that. In the first couple of years, as the Beatles soared, John had been on a high, and his confidence had blossomed. But eventually the fame and idolizing had become too much, and I believe he had turned to drugs to escape. The chasm between us was widening. I still wanted a stable family life and a loving relationship with John, but he was restless. With the end-of-life performing, he was looking for something else to give direction to his life. Although he cared deeply for Julian and me, his addiction to drugs would keep him away from us, and he was most definitely addicted. I knew that he would have to make a determined effort, and needed powerful motivation to give up now. Almost miraculously, the motivation appeared in the form of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George and Patty had become absorbed in Indian spiritual beliefs. Patty had been trying to teach herself to meditate, but was finding it hard going until she went to a lecture about transcendental meditation at Caxton Hall, held by the Spiritual Regeneration Movement. She decided to join, and in August she heard that the movement's leader, the Maharishi, was coming from India to run a summer conference in Bangor, North Wales. A couple of days before the conference he would speak at the Hilton. I stayed at home, but John went with George, Patty, Paul, Jane and Ringo. When he came home he was excited. "It's fantastic stuff, Sin. The meditation's so simple and it's life-changing." Along with the others he'd been bowled over by the Maharishi's charisma and his promises of nirvana.
I think our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. You know, and I think that's what I sussed when I was 16 and 12 way down the line. But I expressed it differently all through my life. It's the same thing I'm expressing all the time. But now I can put it into that sentence that I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, you know. If anybody can put on paper what our government and the American government, etc., and the Russian, Chinese, what they are actually trying to do, you know, and what they think they're doing, I'd be very pleased to know what they think they're doing. I think they're all insane, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. You know, that's what's insane about it. Any kind of artist has a product, unless he's so pure. If he's going to be a real purist, like the Flux people, they should paint their paintings or do their poetry and then rip it up and not show it to anybody.
True, either in a way.
But if you're going to show it to everybody, you know,
no,
and be interested.
John. But the thing is that the main purpose of art is communication. So even in a pure sense, you know, you don't paint and destroy.
But I mean, if you're going to be such a purist that you won't have any like you told me about the Flux people, won't have anything to do with anybody that's vaguely made it.
Yeah, that's
so
true,
what's he doing?
Funny. Yeah,
it's a paradox.
That's a kind of snobbery, you know.
It's inverted snobbery, yes. Yeah. I believed it at one time that if you were an artist and you were going to be really pure, nobody should see it. You know, it was enough to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, through the records, I broke through that. But even with drawings and things, it was with talking to Yoko, and she convinced me, which I knew in my soul, but you know, my prejudice wouldn't have it, that anything I draw or write is just as important communication-wise. I shouldn't just show it to friends. I should put everything out, which is what I'm doing, you know.
Everybody, and welcome to episode 82 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. And this is John Lennon in 1968, part 2, with Matt Williamson from Popco's 60s. Now, if you haven't heard part 1, it was a look at the year itself before delving into the John Lennon and Beatles events. It's not essential. This one can work as a standalone, but it might be useful to hear that, just to whet your appetite. Before I talk about the clips in today's episode, just a quick shout out to the Cinelli brothers, who have a blues band. They're Italian brothers living in London. And Marco sends me CDs and links to his music from time to time, and it's really great stuff. So I've put a link to their website in the show notes. They're a gigging band, and they've also got some CDs as well. Also, over on Life and Life Only, I put out a compilation of 2 appearances I made on the Knick Knack podcast last year. The reason I mention that is that John Lennon did get quite a few mentions, because Knick Knack actually discovered my work through Glass Onion, and then he moved on to Life and Life Only and possibly Film Gold, I'm not sure. But we talk about a few things, including the song I Don't Want to Face It, and of course that killer line, you say you want to save humanity, but it's people that you just can't stand, which I think is still one of the great lines of rock music. Anyway, the clips you just heard, they kind of worked chronologically. First one was from the Cynthia Lennon book, John. That's the audio book. It's not actually Cynthia reading it, although it does sound quite a bit like her, and the lady who reads it's got a great voice. You really do feel like it is Cynthia. She's actually talking about 67, but it was leading into the events of 68. Second one was a famous clip. I believe it was from June, John, when he was with Victor Spinetti, talking about the theatrical adaptation of his books in his own right, expanded in the works. Yes, the famous line, our leaders are all insane. And I think as time goes by, I start to think more and more that had John Lennon lived, never mind talking about him collaborating with Kurt Cobain or listening to hip-hop or whatever it was, I think he could have been a possible godfather to the alternative media that I've been a little bit of a part of. Just the idea of seeing things from afar rather than jumping on these sort of left-right, liberal, conservative simplifications, which probably had validity in the past but don't really anymore. I can imagine John Lennon, we've talked before, firing off missives from Twitter about the world and trying to see things from a wider vantage point. And the last one was from an interview that's known as the dentist interview, because it took place, I think, at a dentist in Knightsbridge, I believe, the end of 68. We do talk about that. John Lennon on the video looks really baked and quite vacant, but it actually doesn't sound that bad when you take the audio only. And listening to that clip back, he sounded a bit more lucid than he looked, put it that way. So, this year was so epic and such a painful trip into his psyche for John Lennon that I thought it required a long podcast that hopefully mostly speaks for itself, 2 hours plus. I actually went to Liverpool in mid-August just for a weekend. Stayed at Rob Ager's house, in fact. And we talked about films and how the world works and all kinds of stuff. And so I've been sort of editing it on the fly, and then putting the clips together was quite long as well. So it's probably been about 3 weeks in the making. And I'm pretty happy with the way it's come out. It's not all conversation. There's lots of sound clips from the riches available for this year. So there's, there's John, more from Cynthia from the audiobook, Yoko, Kenny Everett, and others. There were more, in fact, that I planned, but I had to stop at some point. But there's plenty there. So I'm recording this intro on the 25th of August. Tomorrow is the birthday of Matt Williamson, as you will know from part 1, and also the birthday of the Hey Jude Revolution single. The main topics of this year, really, from the Lennon perspective, and really from the Beatles perspective, would be the India trip, the White Album, the launch of Apple in New York, and obviously in England. In John's life, the switch from being with Cynthia to being with Yoko, and as you'll hear us say, Paul, around the same time, had a switch from Jane to Linda, with a few other ladies in the mix there for both of them. And then the dark spectre at the end of the year of heroin, drug busts and miscarriages for John and Yoko. We don't spend forever on the India trip or the White Album, even though they're just massive topics, and perhaps because they're massive topics, as you'll hear me say later, they've been analysed to death and will be more in the future. But of course, we do comment on them, and I like to think that neither Matt nor I take the easy route and parrot the well-worn facts, cliches, name your word. On the subject of India, I mentioned, I think, recently that I'd watched The Beatles and India, which is a documentary from a few years ago. It was released shortly after Meeting the Beatles in India, which was the Paul Saltzman film. Those two work very well as a double bill, as they don't overlap too much and they have different agendas, aims, focuses, but both well worth a watch. Finally, if you'd like to help out the show, there's a PayPal link on the SoundCloud page for Glass Onion, or you can leave a tip at the Buy Me a Coffee page. buymeacoffee.com/Antony with no H, Rotunno, Rotunno. It's in the show notes. Otherwise, ratings and reviews, always welcome and helpful, and please share links and tell others about the show. So without further ado, I present to you John Lennon in 1968, Part 2 with Matt Williamson. There's no spoken outro today. The next episode will be the return of John Stewart to talk about some more of the Lennon parts of his book, Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God, and that'll be late September, a month from now. So it just remains for me to say enjoy the episode. Hope you're all surviving out there, keeping hold of your sanity, and perhaps take comfort in the fact that your brain, body and psyche probably aren't taking as much of a battering as John Lennon's did in 1968. Anyway, take care, and I will see you soon. Welcome back to Glass Onion on John Lennon. This is part 2 of John Lennon in 1968 with Matt Williamson from Popco's The 60s. Obviously, I hope you listened to part 1, and it might be worth going back otherwise, because we basically set the scene. We talked about the news events of 68 and some of the non-Beatles music, singles and albums, and films as well, although we did include Yellow Submarine, which had arguably quite a tenuous Beatles connection. But anyway. So Matt, really, off the bat, I just wanted to say that kind of a point I mentioned in part 1, really. While the drama of Vietnam's going on, and there's actual death and destruction happening, and there were 2 high-profile assassinations, as we covered, there's this parallel world of the Beatles and John Lennon, but I don't know what you found when you were doing the research, but, a few days ago, I kind of did all the research for this in a 3 or 4 hour session, and the John Lennon Beatles psychodrama of this year is quite astonishing. I mean, even if there wasn't drug use involved, the emotional toll that I can imagine was on John Lennon. A lot of it self-inflicted, yes. If you include the drugs on top of that, and a certain period of withdrawal, which we'll get to, I mean, where do you see 68? Where does it sit in the Beatle years? Is it one of the more dramatic, or are they just all dramatic? What do you reckon?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I think the drama seems to have taken a different turn once Brian Epstein died, because we had mentioned in the first part the folly of Magical Mystery Tour to attempt such a thing without a director or screenwriter. And in 1968, after they did a couple of recordings early in the year, they went to India. I think that they almost wanted some kind of spiritual guidance in order to manage themselves. They allowed themselves to be talked into doing this. And, in 67, they were looking at buying a communal island and all this stuff. And I think the drama of the Beatles hinges always on John Lennon. And Lennon is the one that came back from India, much different than when he arrived, I believe. This was very much a turning point for him. So the trip to India, which I think George and John were there for about 2 months, and Paul for about 6 weeks, and Ringo for maybe about 2 weeks.
10 days, I think.
Yeah, they weren't there for the entire duration, but, that's quite a ways to go to drag the family and the wives and everything to have some kind of spiritual encounter with some kind of education. I think that was very unusual, all this going to India, all while the Vietnam thing is going on and all the turmoil. Mm. And the Beatles are very separate from all of that. I think that's telling.
Yeah, on Glass Onion we'll eventually have done shows on every year of the Beatles, I suppose, and they are all incredible in different ways, but I think everything gets heavier. There's a funny parallel with this other world I'm talking about, of the world outside the Beatles, of Vietnam and civil rights and assassinations, in that things in the Beatle world get darker, the drugs get harder. That was a point I think you made to me when we were doing preparation for this, that part of the thing about the world is that you can almost trace it through the drugs, really. Early 60s was more speed and alcohol. Then there was a pop period. 67, I suppose, is associated with LSD. But then 68, 69, you're talking probably more cocaine, heroin, etc. Quite amazing, really. So we're going to kind of go month by month, but we're not, obviously, with the amount we've got to cover, we won't labour it too much. January, they're coming off Magical Mystery Tour, as you said. Apple Corps opened their first headquarters on Wigmore Street. Just a little quirky sort of thing. John sends his Rolls Royce to the USA for his personal use. They filmed that cameo of Yellow Submarine, so that's January. But then early February, they record a few songs. Lady Madonna, Across the Universe, we've seen the photos of them in the studio. And John Lennon with his fantastic mutton chops, sideburns, and he was obviously growing his hair. One of the quotes from that session, something about, I'm psychologically destroyed and no one's helping me, or something like that. He wasn't happy with Across the Universe. Of course, famously, there's something like 5-6 versions of that. Do you consider that one of the great Beatles songs, maybe apart from the recording?
That's a very good question. The Beatles didn't consider it a great Beatles song because they didn't release it at first, and I mean, the lyrics are some of his best lyrics, I think, of that time period. No question. It's coming off the psychedelic period, and this is one of those songs that he dreamed. It's very interesting to see how these artists are interpreting their dreams for mass audiences, and this is one example of that. It had the potential to be one of the great songs, but it wasn't, because of the production and because Lennon just couldn't figure out how to arrange it. And they made the mistake of bringing in those two apple scruffs from the porch and having them sing background vocals. I thought that was weak. But it just underlines the fact that they didn't take this song seriously enough, and then they went off to India right after.
Tell you what, though, you can kind of make your own pop video by putting a song together with video footage. It may still be online, but there's a wonderful sequence of them in India that was in the anthology with the original version of this song, which I actually think, if no one had told me that they weren't happy with it and it had just been released, I would have been happy with it. I mean, God, the original version with more of an Indian flavour, because it clearly didn't fit on Let It Be / Get Back. I mean, that was clear from the start.
Yeah, one of the reasons I like it, because I like psychedelic music a lot, is that it had one track had backwards guitars on it, and then another track, it had the tambura droning throughout the song.
Yeah.
The backwards guitar segments was wiped clean for the Spector version from Let It Be. He slowed it down a little bit. What I didn't understand was the songs they recorded in early '68, Hey Bulldog, Lady Madonna, Inner Light, Across the Universe. To me, those songs would have been perfect for the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. They relied too much on old stuff. I don't want to say they were getting lazy, but they just did not have the vision. They were just taking on too much. Those songs are all worthy, and they maybe didn't put the time in that they were doing on Peppered and even Magical Mystery Tour, and that they did for the White Album months later. Those songs seem to get short shrifted.
Well, there's a couple of things with that. According to, I think it was George Martin, they were very, very detached from the Yellow Submarine film until they actually saw it and it was successful. That's what George Martin's story was. They didn't think it was a good idea, but then when it was successful, they were delighted.
I think they also felt that would fulfill their film contract. They had to deliver 5 films, and they were very much mistaken on that, too. I don't know how they could not understand that they had to actually appear in it for that to count. But that was a big oversight as well.
Yeah. A couple of other things. There's one rather comical thing with Across the Universe. I'm sure you remember in the Get Back Peter Jackson film, they can't remember the lyrics, so they actually get their acetate from 1968, and they're all sitting around listening to it.
That's right, yeah.
I don't know why that's so amusing, but it just kind of is. I don't know. It's charming in a funny way. It's like, I don't have a recording, let's get our acetate and all sit around listening to it. It's just funny. I guess that it's funny that it was in the film. It was one of those nice bits. The other thing about it, they were clearly stockpiling because they were about to go to India. I mean, this was recorded pretty much days before they left, really. And the famous story is they were shooting a video, quote-unquote, for Lady Madonna, and John pulled out Hey Bulldog, and Yoko was in the studio for that, and he was a bit embarrassed because it was kind of a poppy song. But Hey Bulldog's one of those songs that probably doesn't really mean anything. Maybe, You Can Talk to Me has got significance, but it's one of those songs that's really getting reassessed. You know how Beatles songs kind of go in and out of fashion?
Yeah, I don't know what Lennon had to be embarrassed about. That's, I think, one of the great rock songs, and of all those songs recorded, I think that might be the best. And I think he had some lyrics for it, but they essentially made that song up on the spot. That baffles me. In fact, the lyric, Hey Bulldog, was improvised at the very end, and that's when they started, when Paul barked. So it was actually Hey Bullfrog. So that's how little they had put into the song, it's lyrically.
To be able to just make up a song like that,
That would be considered a throwaway. I think that's possibly why Lennon was a little bit embarrassed. He would be, I'm sure, less embarrassed with the lyrics of Across the Universe, which would be probably more Yoko's speed. But I think Hey Bulldog is just a great song, well-produced, great instrumentation. John and Paul were having fun.
And I really like the sequence in Yellow Submarine. I don't think it's in the final film, but I've seen it. It doesn't really fit the story, but you could argue that most of that's quite random.
Mm.
Right, now we get to one of the really meaty aspects of 1968. Mid-February, John, George and their wives go to India. They're joined by Paul and Ringo. As you said earlier, John and George are clearly the most invested in this of the 4, and they stay the longest.
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Cathay News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who, through transcendental meditation, is currently bringing peace of mind to the Beatles. Flower-loving Yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes. Among his most valued disciples were the Beatles, top of the pop pupils. He did his best to keep them away from outsiders, but George had a way for us. Keeping company with himself, it could be part of the treatment, John stalked along the shady paths. Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene. So different from those not so far off times when just a glimpse of the Beatles was enough to ruin the meditation chances of anyone within earshot. Now, two by two, the world-famous quartet strolled quietly in the lovely meditation preserve. Paul and Ringo shed the cares of their successful world. Close behind, George and John, complete with blanket for even more peace. That great screen star Greta Garbo used to crave solitude. In these days, it's even harder to come by. But the Beatles have found it.
John and George were being drawn toward the Maharishi. What had begun as a passing interest now became a life quest. It was as though, with Brian gone, the four needed someone new to give them direction, and the Maharishi was in the right place at the right time. John and George agreed to go to his ashram, or training centre, in Rishikesh at the foot of the Himalayas in India to study meditation. Patty and I would go too. Paul, Jane, Ringo and Maureen were less convinced about the joys of meditation, but decided to join us. The trip was planned for February 1968, and we would stay for 2 or 3 months. John, always passionate about a new cause, was evangelical in his enthusiasm for the Maharishi, talking about spreading the message to the world and devoting his life to meditation. I was a little more sceptical, but I liked the message and enjoyed the meditation. I hoped, too, that time together in such a peaceful environment and out of the spotlight would be good for John and me. From the airport, we were driven for several hours to the Maharishi's meditation training centre. It was set in a beautiful spot above the forested foothills of the Himalayas, on the banks of the Ganges, and surrounded by vibrant flowers and shrubs. The centre was built to house several dozen students. Each of its low stone cottages contained 5 rooms, and when we arrived, dozens of people of all ages, creeds and races were gathered to take the Maharishi's path to enlightenment. John and I had a room with a 4-poster bed, a dressing table, a couple of chairs and an electric fire. Close by were the Maharishi's house, a swimming pool, a laundry, a post office, and a lecture theatre where we would be expected to gather for regular talks from our leader. I loved being in India, away from the stresses and pressures of our lives. Here there were no fans, no hordes of people, deadlines, demands, or flashing cameras, just peace, quiet, and sweet mountain air filled with the scent of flowers. Best of all, John and I could be together for much of the time. I hoped we would meditate together, grow in mutual understanding, talk, go for walks, and rediscover our lost closeness. In the first week we settled into a routine, meditating for several hours a day and going to lectures, then spending the rest of the time on our own pursuits. It was crisply cold in the mornings, and, having failed to pack warm clothes, we spent much of our time wrapped in the blankets from our beds. The simplicity of life at the ashram, with few material goods, was enormously appealing, and we all enjoyed slowing down and taking the time to breathe. In the evenings we got together, occasionally breaking the no-alcohol rule with a glass of hooch smuggled in by Alex from the village across the river, and tasting remarkably like petrol. Giggling like naughty schoolchildren, we'd pass round the bottle, each taking a swig, then contorting as it scorched its way down our throats.
Just a couple of details. George has his 25th birthday, and of course Mike Love also has a birthday. I'm sure you've heard Spiritual Regeneration, and then they turn it into Happy Birthday, Michael. Da, 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 da. Mm-hmm. And here's something I've never heard addressed. We've already talked about Martin Luther King being killed at the beginning of April. Would the Beatles have heard of that I've never read it in any books about whether they had any comment about that. I don't know, because it happened while they were away, which is another weird juxtaposition, isn't it?
Well, it seems like they were getting the news, and I don't know how they could have not heard about it. And there's still, media types lurking around, but there's been no mention that I've ever seen.
If they didn't hear, of course, that would have been a huge shock when they got home. Depending on how much, I guess John Lennon was fairly engaged in world affairs, and maybe the others were, I don't know. A couple of things while they were away, and then we'll get to the trip itself. In March, fans occupy the Cavern, protesting its closing. So there's a nod to that other world that the Beatles left behind years ago. It was only actually 4.5 years, something like that, since they'd played the Cavern, but it must have seemed like a lifetime ago.
Quite prophetic to happen at that time in 1968 as well.
Absolutely. And then Sgt. Pepper got 4 Grammys, and I would say they'd arguably moved on. It's only been 8 months or something, but they've moved on really to another sort of incarnation. And then Lady Madonna, Back with the Inner Light, is released and goes to number 1. Another little quirk, John sent Ringo a postcard after Ringo had left, addressed to Rick Starr.
John was in many ways closer to Ringo than any other of the Beatles, seeing him as the ordinary man in the street, but also amusing and wise. Ringo wasn't in any way a rival, whereas Paul was as a songwriter and George was as a guitarist. John had always liked Ringo personally. He was his close neighbour at St. George's Hill, Weybridge. Postcard to Ringo, 1968.
Dear Ringo, Mo, Zach, just a little vibration from India. They've got about 2 LPs worth of songs now, so get your drums out. It's still the same here. Dennis got his mantra and everything's great. We've got a film story too. Lots of love, John, Sin and the rest. Kiss, kiss, kiss.
Which I love. It's from the John Lennon letters, a really good book, edited by Hunter Davis. And it's got that sort of Beatles vibe of they're still just a load of mates in a band, because that's what you say to the drummer in your band if you're the songwriter. You ring him up and say, I've got some new songs, get your drums out, let's get to the studio.
Yeah, the songwriting during the trip to India, where they're extremely prolific. They wrote enough songs that lasted them well until like 1971. George Harrison supposedly quipped, hey, we're not here to write the next album, which, coming from him, I was like, well, dude, you're not the one doing most of the writing on the albums anyway. But I think they clearly were inspired. And John and Paul wrote tons of songs. George was writing songs as well. Had they not gone to India, I don't know if they were just in London frolicking around, I don't know what they would have written at that time.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, we're never going to know what the intention was in terms of music, because they obviously brought their guitars. I don't know whether they imagined they would be jamming. I mean, there's some audio of them singing stuff like She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain, and You Are My Sunshine as well. Those kind of songs where there's no songwriting. They're just sort of cool acoustic songs that you might have played at sort of scouts,
Yeah, campfire type songs with the wives around singing. But Donovan had brought his guitar, and of course we have the famous retelling and re-retelling of how he taught the Beatles how to do the claw hammer style of finger picking.
I call it the Travis picking because it sort of was popularized by Merle Travis. But yeah, whatever you want to call it, yeah.
First there is the mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Hello and welcome to Rishikesh in India, and to Donovan, who is me, teaches John Lennon, who is he, how to play the guitar properly. So, Mr. John Lennon, I would just like to thank you for popping along this afternoon and gracing us with your presence.
That's okay, I wasn't doing anything anyway,
Listen to you, Mr. Lazybones, sleeping in the sun.
So what did you want to show me anyway?
Well, today, Mr. John Lennon, I thought I'd show you how to play the guitar with a picking style called the Travis pick.
Please continue, oh master, oh wise one. Yap, yap.
Can I have a close-up of my right hand, please? And so what I want you to do, Mr. John Lennon, is to go away for 2 weeks and try to write a song in that particular style.
Okay, well, I'll give it a go, you know.
And if, Mr. John Lennon, you can come up with something as poetic and beautiful as this next piece, well, I'll be a little more than surprised. Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in the land of Honolulu.
Oh, I think I can definitely come up with something better than that.
Well, I will be the judge of that in 2 weeks' time, when you present your finished work to me. But in the meantime, can we fast forward 2 weeks, please? And tell me, Mr. John Lennon, have you written any songs at all?
I've written 4.
Well, let us hear a quick sample.
Okay, well, the first one is called Julia, right? Half of what I say is meaningless.
Next.
Okay, and the next one's called Look at Me. Look at me.
Next.
And then I wrote this one.
Next.
And then I wrote Happiness is a Warm Gun. She's not a girl who misses much.
Yes, well, it wasn't bad for a start. You got a long way to go before you can match the likes of When the Saints Go Marching In. That's for sure. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I can see the Maharishi emerging from his tent. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, have I told you how to play the Travis picking style at all? Maharishi? Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
So, I mean, it was a very productive time musically for them, not just songwriting-wise, but instrumentally, too, because that guitar picking did figure into the next recordings quite a bit. And all 3 players picked up on that.
Yeah, I mean, during the Get Back sessions, George commented, I've never played every day like this. Mm-hmm. So obviously the January 69 sessions, which obviously we now know weren't as bad as we originally thought, but the practice he got there, but surely in India, I mean, they would have been playing every day. I can't imagine that they would have a day where they weren't.
Yeah, I think Harrison was referring to an actual recording situation.
Right.
You know, either live or playing with the band, because it was so informal in India. Mm. What I had read is that John and Paul would kind of sneak away and do a little songwriting because George was a little bit looking down upon that. Okay, we're here to meditate. And what's interesting is that the whole trip to India, where the Beatles put their careers somewhat on hold, was led by George Harrison. And as Giles Martin suggested, he's like, bands who don't get along don't go on holiday together. And this was not just a holiday. It was very much that, but it was also a series of lectures and a whole meditation process. So it's quite amazing that they did this as a group, you know, and that tells me that they went there very much together.
I think I'm right in saying it was actually they were training to be meditation teachers, but I don't know. Really? I don't know whether they were intending to finish the course. I think they basically gate crashed a teacher training course. Again, if anyone knows better, tell me. But that's what I've read. Everything in their life is just so bizarre. I mean, it's just getting more bizarre by the day. By 68, I mean, it's quite amazing. From the John Lennon perspective, I wanted to talk really about how he started writing songs that were very similar to the ones that would end up on Plastic Ono Band. My listeners will know very well that Plastic Ono Band is my favourite John Lennon album by quite a lot, although there aren't that many to choose from, of course, unfortunately. The John Lennon 68 single album, which you could make and which other Beatles podcasters have made, you can make a John Lennon single solo album and a Paul McCartney one. They work very well. For John, you can include Cross the Universe and Hey Bulldog to make a sort of John Lennon 68 album. What I feel was happening with him is that if we're to believe that they were more or less clean, you know, maybe there was a bottle of whiskey and some weed smuggled in, but, you know, he was off hard drugs. John Lennon went through a massive period of withdrawal and was processing, I would argue, the trauma of his childhood and the trauma of Beatlemania. Plus, you know, he was basically estranged from his wife, as you've read or you've heard the Cynthia book, the John book by Cynthia Lennon, right?
Yes.
And then Yoko's sending in postcards, you know, saying, I'm a cloud in the sky and all that kind of thing.
Meanwhile, I was not having the second honeymoon I'd hoped for. John was becoming increasingly cold and aloof toward me. He would get up early and leave our room. He spoke to me very little, and after a week or two he announced that he wanted to move into a separate room to give himself more space. From then on, he virtually ignored me, both in private and in public. I did my best to understand, begging him to explain what was wrong. He fobbed me off, telling me it was just the effect of the meditation. I can't feel normal doing all this stuff, he said. I'm trying to get myself together. It's nothing to do with you. Give me a break. What I didn't know was that each morning he rushed down to the post office to see if he had a letter from Yoko. She was writing to him almost daily.
Another report, according to Mal Evans, and Ken Womack can probably tell us if that's right when his book comes out, John and George are meditating up to 8 hours a day. Prudence Farrow, of course, was meditating God knows how many hours a day. But what's John Lennon's journey, do you think, in India? What's your reading of it?
Well, I haven't done a lot of research on that, other than the Beatles essentially were still moving together as a unit, like they always really did. It would take some breaks here and there. This was the big outing for 68, and I think John Lennon was, the Maharishi came along at a time when Brian Epstein died, so I think this was the new father figure for Lennon in some ways, and I think there was some attraction to that part of it. I don't know how serious they were about doing it or how far they thought they could take it, but they certainly were seekers. And they were always put, like you said, 8 months earlier they were doing Sgt. Pepper, and they're very far away from Pepper at this point. And the whole musical style and the whole Carnaby Street, it was, they're not in Carnaby Street anymore. They're not in swinging London, they're in India. That's quite a ways, actually. So I don't know what they were thinking of. I think they just thought that they knew they were on the cutting edge of something. And being so close to that edge, they didn't have the vision forward. And it kind of fell apart a little bit. And, Paul wasn't there for the same reasons George was there. Not quite sure why John was there, but he did the best he could do there, then left completely disillusioned, unlike George. Ringo stayed less than 2 weeks. So, it was a valiant attempt. But I'm not sure what they thought if they were all going to come back and be teachers or what. I don't know what they expected to get out of it.
I always find that with the Beatles. I don't know how far they were planning ahead. If you take the view that probably on balance, Paul and Ringo of the four were probably the happiest or the least troubled. I feel like John and George, I think they'd both done a lot of LSD, and I think I would say they're the most troubled of the four, let's say. I don't think there was any reason for Paul McCartney to leave the incredible stuff that he was doing in 68, both in his own songwriting and in producing other people. He was still very invested, for very good reason, in the London scene. There's no reason really for him to want to suddenly drop out and, as you said earlier, put his career on hold. I think John and George, I'd be amazed if they weren't sincere. I think they were, but I don't think they planned ahead much, to be perfect. I don't think John Lennon was famous for planning ahead, put it that way.
Yeah, I think the band in general were just used to having everything turn up roses for them, and without the guidance of, even without touring, I think Epstein could have still managed some of these movements and put it on a timeline and a calendar, say, well, we're going to do this, and then here's your free time in between, your time off. But there was no plan. George Harrison, who, the more I look into the Beatles, he doesn't step up into the leadership role very often, and this is one of those times. And when they came back from India, John and Paul, I think, razzed him a little bit about leading them astray, hence the lyrics to the song Not Guilty. And that song didn't make it onto the final track listing, even though they spent like 100 takes on it. Harrison was struggling, I think, in the band. And the India experience ended up being, I guess, a failure in John's eyes. The Maharishi ended up, there was accusations, I'm not sure. I think he was just looking for a reason to leave and get out of there, actually.
It could be, yeah. Maybe he wanted to go back to Yoko. We don't know.
2 months is a long time. I've never taken a vacation with them. In India, you're completely cut off from everything, and he came back and really chose a very destructive path on it immediately when he came back, which is telling, So, I think you're correct about the meditation. If they were actually meditating up to 8 hours a day, something may have happened where Lennon, without the drugs to medicate himself with, he had to face his childhood past, perhaps. And I'm not sure what the LSD use up to that point played into that. I don't know that it did at all. I think he might have just wound up in the same place. His childhood was completely traumatic, and I think from this point forward, he was always upfront about it. And he displaced that anger onto the Beatles when the Beatles were breaking up. he wanted to blame somebody, and the mom and dad weren't around to blame. He blamed the Beatles. So that's how I kind of see it.
Wow, very interesting. He was always a mixture of gentleness and brutality, sometimes almost at the same time, and you've got this gentle atmosphere. You know, it was a very sweet gesture, the whole Dear Prudence thing. I don't think he calculated and thinking, oh, we've got a new song for the album. I think that's the nice bit of John Lennon, was kind of a childlike sincerity, earnestness, but then he's, at the same time, he's giving his wife the cold shoulder. Like you say, the behaviour we're about to see from him doesn't cast him in a great light, let's be honest, but it makes him compelling. Did want to say one more thing about the India trip. For me, this is really the culmination of a remarkable journey from Liverpool to here. I mean, a lot's been made of John Lennon being sort of the quote-unquote poshest of the Beatles. That's a Paul quote. I've been to that house, you know, Mendips in Menlove Avenue in Liverpool. It's a nice house. It's a comfy house, but, you know, it's not a palace. I mean, they didn't... He's still growing up in a working-class city, even if it's a sort of villagey kind of a suburb. But the journey from there, you know, from listening to Radio Luxembourg, the strains of Elvis Presley coming from thousands of miles away, to going to India in a time when people didn't generally travel. People didn't go to India, particularly if they came from Liverpool, you know. It's an incredible journey, but then it's not really an end point, is it? Because the drama just went on when they got back, you know.
Yeah, I mean, going to India, one of the ulterior motives of Cynthia Lennon was to help repair the marriage. It was in big trouble, partly due to drugs. That's the single-handedly one thing that Cynthia talks about, how she lost John Lennon, was LSD. So in India, well, as you mentioned, they weren't really doing any of those drugs. And there was a detachment while there with Cynthia Lennon, and it was all going to come crashing down very quickly.
Yep. All right. We'll just go through a few of the details that will be very well known, I imagine, to our listeners. So the Maharishi's confronted. Again, we still don't know. Did Magic Alex put them up to it?
Whose idea was to go to India?
I don't know. Probably George's. I've no idea. You know. No. We met around then, but I was going to take I lost my nerve because I was going to take my wife and Yoko, and I didn't know how to work it, you know. So I didn't do it. I didn't quite do it.
Sexy Sadie you wrote that one.
That's about Maharishi. I copped out and wouldn't write Maharishi. What have you done? You made a fool of everyone.
When did you realise that he was making a fool of you?
Somebody said, you know, there was a big hullabaloo about him trying to get off with me and a few other women and things like that. And we went down to him. We'd stayed up all night discussing was it true or not true, you know. And when George started thinking it might be true, I thought, well, it must be true, because if George is doubting it, there must be something in it. So we went to see Maharishi. The whole gang was the next day charged down to his hut, you know, his bungalow, his very rich-looking bungalow in the mountains. And I was the spokesman. As usual, when the dirty work came, I actually had to be leader, whatever the scene was. When it came to the nitty-gritty, I had to do the speaking. And I said, we're leaving. Why? Me? You know, all that shit. And I said, well, if you're so cosmic, you'll know why. Because he was always intimating, and there were all these, his right-hand men intimating that he did miracles, you know. And I was saying, you know why? He said, I don't know why, you must tell me. And he gave me a look like, you know, I'll kill you, bastard. He gave me such a look, and I knew then, when he looked at me, you know, because I'd called his bluff, that if you know, you know all, you know, cosmic conscious, that's what we're all here for. And I was a bit rough to him, you know.
You're expecting too much from him.
I always do, you know. I always expect too much. I always expect in my mother and don't get her. That's what it is, you know, or some parents. I know that much.
A couple of weeks before we were due to leave, Magic Alex accused the Maharishi of behaving improperly with a young American girl who was a fellow student. Without allowing the Maharishi an opportunity to defend himself, John and George chose to believe Alex and decided we must all leave. I had seen Alex with the girl, who was young and impressionable, and I wondered whether he, whom I had never once seen meditating, was being rather mischievous. I was surprised that John and George had both chosen to believe him. By dawn the next morning, Alex had organised taxis from the nearby village, and we left on the journey back to Delhi and a plane home. After 8 weeks, the dream was over. I hated leaving on a note of discord and mistrust when we had enjoyed so much kindness and goodwill from the Maharishi and his followers. Once again John was running away, and I had little choice but to run with him. The journey home was long and grim. I was close to tears, and John was paranoid, afraid that the Maharishi would take his revenge on us in some way. We had planned to spend a night in Delhi, but the hotel was full, and Alex had discovered that if we hurried, we could make the night flight to London. I hated the rush, which seemed unnecessary, but with the others setting the pace, we hit the road and just made the flight.
I think I'm right in thinking George and Patty stayed on in India. John and Cynthia left. He gets drunk on the plane, tells her about all his infidelities. Again, depending on who you believe, Goldman, perhaps not surprisingly, makes a big play of, he would even point out people she knew. One of his infidelities that doesn't put him in a great light was Sunny Freeman, who was the wife of Robert Freeman, who was a photographer who took some famous Beatles photos.
Yes.
Because they were actually living in the same building. So that was very close to home. We don't know who Norwegian Wood was about exactly. Maybe Maureen Cleave, Eleanor Bron, who knows.
Mm.
And as you said, when he gets back, I mean, he goes into a real mad phase, you know. Now, one of the things I think we've chatted about before was April 20th, John takes acid with Derek Taylor. You weren't happy with this, were you? Who has to rebuild, along with Neil Aspinall, Lennon's shattered ego. Listen to this. Derek Taylor's book. The kids woke up to see John Lennon stretched out on the floor in a crucifix position, thin as a twig, straggly long hair all over the place. Taylor also recalled they went out in a rowboat on the lake and with Aspinall's help produced a long and rambling discourse provisionally entitled Thoughts on LSD. So how about that?
Yeah, Derek Taylor to me is the thing you had here is, you know, Derek Taylor took responsibility for helping to rebuild John's shattered ego. Thanks, Derek, Dr. Derek Taylor. He's one of the people I view as far as the Beatles coterie. He had the biggest bar bill when they started Apple, basically. You know, he was a guy that was along for the party. You can see this when he was in Los Angeles through the late 70s with his affair with Stevie Nicks. I mean, he was always in on the party. He was a partier. Great writer. Great PR guy. He's had some PR blunders, too, which I touch upon in some of my other videos and other bands, particularly American bands. But, yeah, this whole reintroduction of John binging on acid, immediately getting back from India where he was clean. Why the need? Why do you have to go to make-believe land? So, yeah, this is all very interesting because he hits it hard.
Well, I suppose if I can make a parallel, I used to smoke cigarettes and I managed to give up at a certain point. But a few times when I tried to give up, I would have no cigarettes for about 3 days, and then the addiction would kick back in, and I would just chain smoke. So if we take John Lennon as having a quote-unquote addictive personality, I don't even know if that exists, you know, that's a matter of debate, then he'd been without his drugs, and he probably enjoyed the meditating, and he probably felt like maybe he was turning a corner, then it all went sour. Perhaps, as you suggested, he may have even engineered that somehow. Maybe there's some self-sabotage element to him. It's only a theory of mine, but I had a bit of experience of that. When you're trying to kick an addiction and you kick it, but then you start to feel bad, you might go back to the addiction twice as bad. I don't know.
Yeah, I never viewed John being addicted to LSD, although he was taking it quite a lot. I don't know if that constitutes an addiction or not, but this time period of taking it, I mean, this is kind of past the LSD craze, shall we say, from 65 to 67. So he's back on it again, and some very odd things happened during this time.
Very good segue, yeah, there we go. Here's a kind of a comical one. I don't even know if this is true, but I'm going to read it anyway. April the 21st. In London, it's reported that the Beatles did not receive the diplomas, crediting them as, quote, gurus, since they didn't pass the 3 obligatory tests of the Maharishi's Academy of Transcendental Meditation. With the Beatles, you always need some comedy, so...
That is very good, yeah.
The Beatles officially didn't become gurus. I mean, I guess the point being that they didn't finish this sort of teacher training or whatever they were doing, so they didn't become meditation teachers. And as we said earlier, they probably weren't intending to anyway. Now we get to May. Now, of all the crazy months in John Lennon's life, this ranks among the craziest. Now, there's a book called Lennonology by Chip Madinger, and Chip Madinger has been on the show. Unfortunately, I haven't got to Lennonology, and the price is being charged online. I'm not saying this is Chip's fault. Are quite ludicrous, so I haven't read it yet. But I do know through him kindly sending me a PDF and some interviews he did that we're now fairly sure that John and Yoko's night together, where they produced 2 Virgins, happened a little bit earlier than we thought. It was always thought to be the May the 19th, but Chip Madinger is fairly convinced it was the 3rd of May. Okay, so we'll go through a little bit of the chronology here. 3rd of May was probably the day when John called a press conference at Apple to announce that he was Jesus Christ. And that night, Yoko comes over. They do acid and make 2 virgins. The next morning, Pete Shotton recounts, because Pete Shotton had been there, had gone up to bed before them. That's where he says, you know, this is what I've been waiting for all my life. I'll go and live with her in a fucking tent, etc. And then they're found by Cynthia, and we get this whole thing of... Now, I don't buy the fact that Yoko was wearing Cynthia's dressing gown. Maybe that's true, but that just seems a bit too Yoko-bashy to me. That seems like a kind of a detail that would really fit the Yoko as a dragon idea. You were mentioning, did you read the Cynthia Lennon John book, or did you do the audio book?
I did both, actually. I think she gives a pretty balanced view. Generally, she's so nice that even the stuff that she has, you know, most women would be not very charitable. She's rather charitable even to Yoko Ono.
The idea of breaking up was still inconceivable to me, perhaps because my own parents had never contemplated such a thing. I fully expected that John and I would stay together and find a way to work through our problems. What I hadn't allowed for was that John's history, his attitude to marriage, and the family were very different from mine. He had hardly ever seen his parents together. His own father had suffered in the same way. Given how often and uncannily we repeat the patterns of our parents, I should perhaps have been more prepared for John to leave his own marriage and 5-year-old son. But I was too young, too inexperienced, and too determinedly optimistic to take it seriously. Jenny and Alex came with me to Kenwood to see if John fancied dinner out. We arrived at 4 in the afternoon, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The porch light was on, the curtains were still drawn, and everything was silent. There was no Dot to greet me, no Julian bounding through the door shouting with delight for a hug. What was going on? The front door was unlocked. The 3 of us walked in and began to look for John, Julian, and Dot. "Where are you all?" I called, still expecting them to appear from behind a door, laughing at the joke. As I put my hand on the sunroom door, I felt a sudden frisson of fear. I hesitated for a second, then opened it. Inside, the curtains were closed, and the room was dimly lit, so it took me a moment to focus. When I did, I froze. John and Yoko were sitting on the floor, cross-legged and facing each other beside a table covered with dirty dishes. They were wearing the terry-cloth robes we kept in the pool house, so I imagined they had been for a swim. John was facing me. He looked at me, expressionless, and said, "Oh, hi." Yoko didn't turn around. I blurted out the only thing I could think of. "We were all looking forward to dinner in London after lunch in Rome and breakfast in Greece. Would you like to come?" The stupidity of that question has haunted me ever since. Confronted by my husband and his lover, wearing my dressing gown, behaving as though I was an intruder, all I could do was carry on as if everything were normal. In fact, I was in shock, operating on autopilot. I had no idea how to react. It was clear that they had arranged for me to find them like that, and the cruelty of John's betrayal was hard to absorb. The intimacy between them was daunting. I could feel a wall round them that I could not penetrate. In my worst nightmares about Yoko, I had not imagined anything like this. As I stood in the doorway, rooted to the spot in shock and pain, John said, indifferently, "No thanks." I turned and fled.
But yeah, this whole couple days, this 36-hour period where John Lennon takes LSD with Pete Shotton, calls the meeting at Apple for the Beatles and a couple of the principals, exclaims he's Jesus Christ. I think the Beatles just say, well, okay, and I assume it's a rather short meeting, and then they go out to dinner. They just kind of placate John Lennon. And then that night again, Shotton and Lennon are together again, more acid. Yoko Ono enters the scene that night, and they make love and do the recording Two Virgins. And after that, you know, the quote you just said about this is what I've been waiting for all my life, that's quite a revelatory statement.
Hmm.
Now, he had known Ono for a good year and a half, and she was sending him these letters, and I think he was, you know how it is in the early glow of love when you're with a girl and now you're getting letters and you get those butterflies. So that was probably going on while he was in India, and he's going down to the post office daily to see if he got any letters from her and all that stuff. I completely understand that. But when he comes back here, and with the combination of the LSD, and it's just very strange because it just turns on a dime.
I kind of feel like, having got to know him somewhat, I mean, over 30 years really, but particularly doing this podcast. I always say to my listeners, this is my best guess. I think him going all in kind of fits the psychological profile of him. Because I had a bit of this as well when I was young, and I was somewhat influenced by him, but I think I had it in my personality anyway, of always looking for that one person or that one thing that ticks all the boxes. I had loads of that myself, so I could kind of understand that. Not that it necessarily matters, but we have some evidence that they probably had a sexual relationship before then. His chauffeur, Les Antony, said that he was obviously having affairs, we know for a fact. He was having affairs sort of left, right and centre, including in 1967. One of his old art school friends did an exhibition, and there was a girl there that John Lennon went off with. But let's take him at his word and say that May 1968 was where, they kind of decided they got together once and for all. But there's a few interesting details. I was just listening, because I do like to mention other Beatles podcasters when they deserve it. The Nothing Is Real podcast, which I really enjoy. I love that. And I know one of them, Stephen at least, listens to this, so hi to him. They did a long show, which I haven't finished, about Hey Jude. But they go through all this sort of background, and they talk about, John and Paul were doing a lot of what they call tomcatting. They were still sort of skirt chasing.
Oh, yeah.
And interestingly, if we go by Cynthia's account, her and John kind of got back together a few days later. So what I said to you the other day was that John Lennon, in a sense, he had this great union with Yoko and then immediately, quote-unquote, cheated on her. I say quote-unquote because can you cheat on someone with your own wife? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this John Lennon's way of being all in was always temporary. His all-ins were never long-lasting. He was wavering here, and in the Cynthia book, John, it's interesting when he would come back from tour, they would have very good home life together. He needed a break from the road. And even Lennon said that, we did not have an unhappy marriage. There was happiness within the marriage. But obviously he needed more than that. He needed more than just a resting place. And he did go back to Cynthia after this encounter with Yoko here, at least for a week or so. But then another week later, and he was completely out. She didn't deserve to be treated in that way. And maybe that's the only way he could have done it. Some people are just bad breaker-uppers, Yeah. And John Lennon was one of those guys. And I understand that. But there's probably a better way he could have done it. He wasn't very manly.
This is not to defend him, but when I studied psychology, one of the things that we did, we looked at, I don't know how many it is, but there's 30 or 40 classic psychological profiles. Okay, and obviously people are different, everyone's complex, but there's a certain profile where the behaviour is somewhat predictable. So there were 30 or 40, and I remember it was when I was first getting into John Lennon and the Beatles, sort of at the same time, and he fits a certain profile. There's definitely some arrested development. A lot of his actions are very what you would expect from a child. I don't mean that in a patronising way, but again, this is sort of well known in psychology. A sort of childish reaction in the sense of, like I say, going all in or thinking this is going to be my new daddy or whatever. And one of the other things is an absolute horror of confrontation. So someone like John Lennon, if he's drunk, he's going to confront people. Okay, this is a very common thing. I've said on the podcast, I had a friend at school who was very John Lennon-like. So I was able to sort of observe him. When he was drunk, he was very confrontational. And I felt like it was a sort of compensation because when he wasn't drunk, he couldn't confront anything, including things which needed to be confronted. So there is a kind of a profile there that sort of rings true. So he didn't treat her well, yes, and I'm not making excuses for him, but I think a certain profile, almost the only way they can deal with that is by being brutal.
Yeah, and the only way to cut the cord. And I think, he wasn't the first husband to leave a wife and kid behind, and just, it's very common. Men sometimes just up and leave and never come back, much like John Lennon's own father. Not quite what his father did, but very close.
There's another aspect to this, I guess. Matt Sergio was on the show, episode 63, and I know you said you listened to that, The Occult Beatles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a good show, and there's a weird parallel. In 1975, John Lennon was with May Pang, and again, depending on who you believe, they were actually planning, he told her he was going to divorce Yoko and they were going to move in together in New York. John Lennon goes for this smoking cure, we all know this story, but we don't know which version we believe, and comes back not the same person. May Pang says, he had a sort of weird look in his eyes, seemed to be hypnotised, I mean, he had been apparently hypnotized to cure smoking, but there's a suggestion that perhaps Yoko, I don't know, in some roundabout way hypnotized him. It's very telling that in Cynthia Lennon's book, when she catches them, which we think is something like the 5th of May, John Lennon has a completely vacant look in his eyes, and she says, quote unquote, something like, that wasn't the same John. Got this sort of blank stare in his eyes, and she said, would you like to come to dinner? And he's like, no, I don't want to, but with zero emotion.
I've always felt, in all the research I've done on the Beatles and John Lennon, I mean, John Lennon was fairly easy to manipulate. He would get very excited about certain things, and this whole jumping 2 feet in, only to jump out. And I think that the May Pang story in 75, where the quote I remember is he seemed stupefied after this potion that he was given to drink to cure his smoking. And Yoko Ono's involvement in the occult is fairly well documented. I don't have any proof on this, but it seemed like John Lennon could be controlled in some way, and it seemed like what some people would say, he seemed like a different person, or didn't seem to be himself, or all there. You see this in a couple instances, turning points with Yoko Ono. So I'll leave that with the audience too. I don't have any more to offer on that, but I think that's worth going into. I think there is something to that. The whole idea of involving Magic Alex to insinuate that she's having some kind of affair and divorcing her on grounds of her infidelity is ridiculous. And to try to not give her and his son ample payment and these types of things. So that all is very unflattering, and it's a shame, because it's not like she certainly had his back from the day they dated. And to be repaid that way is hard to hear about a hero like John Lennon, but that's how it is.
Yeah, having said that, I think that Lennon Naked, if you've seen that BBC thing they did, I think that maybe laid it on slightly thick. I mean, that may have been the truth, but that's the thing with John Lennon. I mean, there was a very compassionate side, but the strange thing about it was that, again, from the Cynthia book, when he was doing the bed-in, young Julian, about 6 years old or something, is quoted as saying, why is Daddy in bed talking about peace? And he said later, it's another one of those things that kind of fits this profile, is someone who cares a lot about the world at large, but has a lot of trouble caring about people that are close to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say that he was a caring. I don't go with the Goldman thing of saying he was never generous and he wasn't loving. There's too many people who have been on this show who knew him who say that's not true. He's just too much of everything. But I think confrontation was a huge problem for him. So I think that's perhaps one of the reasons it came out so brutally, We also have the night he met Brigitte Bardot. I think everyone knows that story.
I think that's an untold story. I only found out about that recently. But why don't you go ahead and tell that one? That's another LSD story.
Yes. Well, okay, so this is what I remember of it. He loved Brigitte Bardot when he was a teenager, and he used to have a poster of her on the wall. Teenager in his bedroom, fill in the rest, folks. Him and Paul had quite serious girlfriends at the same time. One of them was Cynthia, of course. They used to get their girlfriends to look like Brigitte Bardot, so she dyed her hair blonde. So he was in love with her. Well, not in love with her, in lust with her. And in 1968, it came up that, I don't know who arranged it, maybe it's just Derek again, that he was going to get to meet her. He was nervous. Him and Derek did LSD and apparently got drunk because there were loads of cans of beer. And she went out to dinner or something, and he said, when you come back, I'll write a song for you. She came back. He played about 2 bars of it and then collapsed. Who knows if that's true? But anyway, he had this opportunity to meet and perhaps copulate with the object of his teenage lust, but he blew it. Just another day in John Lennon's life.
Yeah, that's a story I only just found out recently, and I always kind of felt bad. Well, he's too fucked up to do anything, to even talk to her, really.
Yeah.
I wish I could hear Bardot's telling of that story. I don't think we've heard that, but she's still alive. I mean, I don't know if she's ever been asked or it's ever been written about.
Well, she apparently had a tryst with Jimi Hendrix, if you knew that.
I did not know that.
At an airport, apparently, yeah. I mean, Brigitte Bardot was a stunningly good-looking woman, and in 1968 she was still only in her 30s,
Well, she's got to be in her mid-80s by now.
Yeah, I think she is, yeah. Okay. I believe Yoko moved into Kenwood towards the end of May. But in the middle of the month, John and Paul go to New York. Again, thanks to the Nothing Is Real guys, they uncovered something interesting about this tomcatting. John and Paul were originally going to stay at the St. Regis Hotel, but apparently the fans sort of almost doing a Beatlemania thing outside. So they instead stayed at Nat Weiss's, Brian Epstein's lawyer. They stayed at his flat, and John Lennon apparently was getting it on with a maid. So again, if he got together with Yoko in early May and said to Pete Shotton, "This is it, all my life," he's already cheated on her twice.
Well, I mean, he's just going from place to place, and it's just like a 18-year-old.
Yeah, well, that's where him and Paul, for all that's said about their different personalities, they did have a lot of similarities. And, they were both up to it because famously in New York, Paul apparently hooks up with Linda, and she's at the press conference they give in the hotel where they're sort of announcing Apple. But months later, which hopefully we'll get to eventually, he's out with Francie Schwartz publicly in July. So I think, they were just sort of getting what they could, and maybe it was a sort of a last hurrah before they settled down, because maybe Paul thought Linda probably is the one. I mean, who the hell knows? There's this big thing about the 1968 that something happened after India, and we still have no idea what it was. And there may have been some catalyzing event around this period or in the summer, but we just have no idea,
John and Paul, well, the Beatles in general, I mean, I can't imagine the women throwing themselves at them all those years, and they just got used to it. I think McCartney had secret apartments in London, I've heard, for his little trysts, and, A Girl in Every Port, and Peggy Lipton, the actress from the Mod Squad, was one of them, and I think he may have met with her during this trip, but wound up with Linda. They had met before, but you had said Francie Schwartz was his main girlfriend back in London when he got back there for a couple of months during the White Album recordings.
That's right.
And during that time, Jane Asher finally broke it off with Paul McCartney. So McCartney was going through some period as well where he kind of lost his fiancée. They were engaged. Jane Asher didn't seem like the type to really put up with too much of the philandering, but whether she knew or not, I don't know. She's never talked about, which is also very classy of her.
Yes.
But these guys are, it's just everywhere. Everything's being shoved at them. Drugs, sex, everything. And it'd be hard to turn some of that down. Brigitte Bardot, come on.
Absolutely. Yeah, this trip to New York is very interesting because we've got a lot of footage. I mean, they did an interview with Larry Kane where they're very playful.
Gentlemen, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Larry.
Lovely. What is Apple, John?
It's a company we're setting up which involves records, films, electronics, which make records and films work, and what's it called, manufacturing?
Yeah, it does a few things.
The byproducts that end up with Larry Page T-shirts and that.
It's just trying to mix business with enjoyment.
Pleasure.
Are you the directors of this?
Yeah. But like all the profits won't go into our pockets. They'll go to help people, but not like a charity.
What do you plan?
Somebody wants to make a film and they go to a company and they get shown into the waste paper bin. And nothing ever happens. So they go around, they make an underground one, and it goes round and round underground, and a lot of people never see it. So if they come to us, they won't stand a chance. But we hope to make a thing that's free, where people can just come and do and record and not have to ask, could we have another microphone in the studio, because we haven't had a hit yet.
How expansive, how large will this be here?
Oh, well, like that.
We don't know yet. It'll be big, I think.
We're just blowing up the balloon.
There's lots of things, we just got a friend of ours who's in electronics.
Oh, yeah.
Who's called Alex. And he's great, he's a Greek fella. And he's invented incredible things. So that'll be big.
Are the days of the Beatles on stage over?
Well, they've been over for the last 2 years because we've been on land. But you never know, do you? With all these incredible electronics, we might come flying over New York playing one day.
Did you enjoy the trip over to India?
Yes.
The journey was terrible, but the trip was all right.
There was a report that, now we get very bad reports.
Smashed him.
That you didn't like it, or you didn't have the patience, and you decided to go home.
We were there 4 months, or George and I were.
No,
we lost 13 pounds and we looked a day older.
Do you think this man's on the level?
I don't know what level he's on, but
he's on the level.
We had a nice holiday in India and came back rested to play businessman.
We got this one at this hotel. It used to be called the Americana Hotel. I think it's the Sheraton now. I think I've got that right. And I mean, God, there's another weird parallel because Mark David Chapman stayed at the Sheraton.
Oh, did he?
Oh, God. I do know from reading books, again, as far as you can know, there were a lot of drugs going around on that trip. And they're kind of testy and playful at the same time, or John is anyway.
today?
To do this.
What is this?
What does it look like? What? What are you doing here? It's a business concerning records, films and electronics. And as a sideline, whatever it's called, manufacturing or whatever.
One of his great quotes is about Apple.
So we want to set up a system whereby people who just want to make a film about anything don't have to go on their knees in somebody's office, probably yours.
It's such a great quote. What's your reading of John and Paul on this trip?
Well, there's another interview where they're talking about, I don't know if it's the same interview, but talking about Paul having talked about LSD publicly, and then everybody turning on him and how John Lennon was defending him.
Oh, that's it, yeah.
And that they seem both pretty lit.
Yeah.
McCartney in particular. McCartney's just kind of being kind of coy, and, you know, it seemed like that was their last hurrah. That was the last time they maybe went and did their trip to Spain or their partying together as a duo, because Ringo and George were back in England, and McCartney picks up Linda, and then shortly after that, you know, Lennon's back with Yoko, and then that's, I think when he gets back from that trip is when the Yoko thing becomes permanent.
Yeah, 68 is a huge time for both of them, because they both marry. I mean, Yoko Ono's Japanese, but let's call her Japanese American. They both marry or get together with older ladies who, let's say, are either American or lived in America. So it's a funny similarity. Of course, they get married within a week of each other, and no one's ever said for sure whether that was planned. We just don't know.
Yeah, and both Yoko and Lennon attended the same college. I mean, they're both divorced with a daughter. I mean, there's a lot of similarities.
Both daughters born in 1963 as well. There you go.
Yes. Very interesting.
Yoko met Paul first before John. I doubt anything happened between them, but, you know, you can never rule it out. And Linda was attracted to John before she was attracted to Paul. It just goes on, these weird coincidences, parallels, very, very strange. And also on that trip, they famously go on The Tonight Show and Johnny Carson doesn't show up, or he's on a holiday or something. And that's apparently a bit of a car crash. We got some audio of that. It's not too bad, I suppose. But I think, yeah, you said they were lit up. I'd agree with you. They look kind of off their heads, to be honest.
Yeah, and let's face it, this whole Apple thing was a complete disaster, absolute utter disaster, and they're trying to, this whole trip to New York is a PR move, where they're trying to pass it off as some kind of Western communism. This is nonsense. This was a tax shelter, pure and simple, and this idea that they would invite everybody, they had this ad campaign, send us your tapes, and none of these guys listened to any of that. It was all just a ruse. It was all front. And I think that tells you something. And they tried to live up to the front. They were in way over their heads.
I don't know so much with Paul, but definitely with John Lennon, there is a naivety there for sure. And as you said earlier, you said he's quite easy to manipulate. I think on one day he would be, on another day he wouldn't, because he was sort of weirdly streetwise. He seemed to understand the world fairly well. Through Mark Lewison, we found out that he read 1984 and Brave New World as a child or a teenager. And for me, again, listeners, if you read those two, that's basically today's society. It's a sort of mixture of the two. But then he was also sort of naive and childlike at the same time. That's why he's so fascinating, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was extremely well read. I mean, Lewison also uncovered that Lennon was reading 2 to 3 newspapers per day, front to back. Yeah. Prolific reader, read at a very early age. I think at the age of 3 or 4 was reading. So this guy, extremely sharp guy. But when it came, I think he just, I'm not a doctor here, but I'm speculating that the mother and father figure was just something that was traumatic to him, losing both of those. And kind of there was a search to find it. And when he found a little glimpse of it, he maybe grabbed on a little bit too long or too hard, i.e., maybe Brian Epstein, Maharishi, Alan Klein.
Yeah, Yanov as well.
Yanov, yeah.
Yep. Going to move the chronology forward a little bit. So at some point, about a week after they get back, they do the Isha demos. Very well covered by other podcasters. I'll just mention something that Richard Buskin said many years ago. It's fascinating how we've got the 1960 tapes. Those ones just before they go to Hamburg, where they're a very ropey little band. And then we've got the Isha demos, and it's almost exactly 8 years. And just the changes. Oh, here goes the dog.
Hey, I'll be right back.
Okay. That was Matt's dog, ladies and gentlemen. It's just a shame he didn't start yapping while we were talking about Hey Bulldog. We missed a trick there. Maybe if you can send me a tape of it barking, I'll put it in at the appropriate moment. Just an idea. So you got the Isha demos, this incredible 8-year journey. Everything they've been through, 800 years. At the end of May, Apple Tailoring opens, and then May the 30th, we've got the start of the White Album sessions. Now, of course, this is a podcast in itself, just this, so we're going to have to go kind of skim the surface. But I think of all the sessions I could be at, I used to think I'd want to be at the Sgt. Pepper sessions, but Hunter Davis, who was actually there, said, yes, it was the Beatles, yes, it was Sgt. Pepper, yes, it was amazing on one level, but it was also boring to be at those sessions, to hear them spend 7 hours doing a rhythm track and then sometimes reject it. But I think these sessions are quite astonishing, and really, I suppose, from the engineers that were working there, the two polar opposite accounts are Geoff Emerick, who arguably is a bit of an unreliable narrator based on some of the stuff in his book, and Ken Scott. Geoff Emerick says they were terrible, and he walked out, in fact. And you might argue that walking out on such a dream job as engineering the Beatles, maybe the sessions were that bad. Ken Scott said they were fairly okay.
What happened, I was working with Paul in number 2 studio, and John might be in number 3 studio working with someone else, and then, George might be in another studio working with someone else. So they were gradually sort of splitting up,
Without Brian Epstein at the helm, the group were beset by the additional pressures of business. So much so that even the recording studio, usually a creative refuge for them, stretched their tolerance to breaking point. Their recording engineer, Geoff Emerick.
Things were getting very tense in the studio, and they were arguing amongst themselves, and I left for a while, halfway through, and I went down into the studio and said, I can't take all this arguing, really, amongst yourselves. And then John said to me, he said, well, look, this environment, we're so closed in with this that it's adding to our problems and pressures. They really wanted to get out of the studio. This was the problem. They were just locked in there, and they knew they couldn't get out. They probably couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They were halfway through the White Album, probably just a third into it. And I just couldn't mentally take the strain of seeing them argue amongst themselves down in the studio. Looking back, I can be sympathetic to be locked in that awful-looking studio where get a little bit humorous about it, even to bring a coloured light, to brighten the place up in was a big deal. I mean, we had these terrible white enamelled globe things that used to hang from the ceiling with cobwebs on, and I believe John or someone said, well, at least can you just bring a coloured light in, so just let us look at a coloured light instead of white light all day and night. And again, there was a big production number, and they walked in with a red fluorescent tube and put it on this huge stand, and I believe that's still there today at Abbey Road, and just switched it on, and at least to see a red fluorescent tube glowing in the studio was uplifting and calming for a while, It was incredible. At the time of leaving, it was, to me, the album was impossible to mix. It needed a fresh mind to come in and actually have a clear mind, to be able to sit there probably for 3 days and just listen to it, to sort out what could be done with it, basically. And it was just messy recording. They deliberately play where they weren't supposed to play and things like that, generally to make the job harder than it really was. I mean, it was getting that bad.
They were taking more control of their own songs. It was more solo-ish. But with regard to sort of all the stories of the acrimony and all of that kind of thing that supposedly went on during that recording, it's utter rubbish. Once again, when doing the book, I wanted to make sure I wasn't remembering it through rose-coloured glasses. So I went to Chris Thomas, who was George Martin's assistant during the album, and John Smith, who was my second engineer for most of the project. And I said, what do you remember about doing the album? And they said, it was a blast. We had so much fun. And the thing is, I've done 2-week projects. That's what so many of the albums back in the day were. But we got 2 weeks to record the album. And at one point or another during the 2 weeks, the artistic temperament comes up and someone gets mad. Now, if it happens during a 2-week project, a 6-month project like the White Album, it's going to happen more than once. And that's all it was. It was that artistic temperament. I want it my way, and that's how it's going to be. It was that kind of thing. It wasn't them obliterating each other because they hated each other. Ringo left because he didn't think that they appreciated him, and that started him doubting his own talent. That started them all along the same lines. Well, I'm not appreciated, so maybe I should leave. And then finally, once they all got to talk about it properly, They realised how important each one was to each other, that the four of them were a team. It was an amazing team. And after that, when Ringo came back and George had filled the entire studio with flowers to welcome him back, they were as tight as they had been right at the very beginning. They were doing nothing but playing all together. There was so much live stuff that was going on in the studio. It was incredible to watch. It was amazing.
It all starts with Revolution 1, which is the slow revolution. And then we get this Yoko. Have you heard the Yoko tape? She was recording herself talking while they were recording.
I've heard some of that.
It's interesting, and she does sound like a little girl, which I kind of found quite charming. She employs a bit of sort of cod psychology, and she says Paul and John have got this psychic bond and everything, but also on that tape she says things like "you become naked," which of course will be used on Revolution 9, and there's a few other things she says.
This is Tuesday, the 6th June 1968. Right now you're in the other room, and I'm just sort of embarrassed, and I don't know if I should be coming or not. But you're in my mind all the time. So I guess that's what it is. You look so intense. Maybe you're angry or something. Me. I don't know. So I'm afraid to go near you now. But it's nice to see it that way too. George Martin looks much better now to me. Now that I found out that he's from a working class.
Hello, can you hear me?
I feel like running out of this room. If anybody in the world would know how I feel now, I'm the most insecure person in the world right now. John is not here. He went into the hall. I don't know for what. He's out for a long time. I think probably he's calling home. I don't know. He's been with her for over a decade. And the other child. I don't know what to make of it. I don't want to think about it. It's either that he had a terribly weak character. I've never been with anyone so long, so I wouldn't know. I must think that I'm going to go insane. John made a beautiful loop, and he's throwing that in to Revolution. It's very intense.
It's a very curious thing, you know, for you and the listeners. I would try and listen to it because it's just fascinating. And then, of course, famously, Paul goes off to America quite early into the sessions, and they do Revolution 9 without him. Now, of course, I've done a show on that, episode 25. George and Ringo help. It's the only time, I might have the date here, June the 20th. It was the only time that 3 studios were employed at the same time for one track. I would love to have been a fly on the wall. You got John Lennon commandeering 3 studios, and you got tape loops and all kinds going on, and engineers in white coats, which is hilarious. They were in white coats, apparently. I don't know if they still were in 68. Oh, what can we say about the White Album that hasn't been said in 100 podcasts before? Where does it sit in Beatles albums for you personally?
Well, I'm not a big ranker when it comes to the Beatles in general. I just look at all their music as one body of work. And this one, I do remember listening to this for the first time. So I was about 9 or 10 years old. That's when I started listening to albums and stopped listening to singles. And I remember this album striking me as being far more serious. And there is a bit of a darkness to it, but it has all the wonderful Beatle trademarks woven into all that. And I found it every bit as lovable as any of the work. It's obviously, the last few years, a lot of people rank this as their best work. I think we've gotten away from the old narrative that they were basically 3 solo albums. That's been debunked, because you can't crank out that amount without working together on some level and then divvying it up when need be for overdubbing. this is another instance of two things. They maybe bit off a little bit more than they could chew, although the final result doesn't really suggest that. But it also does speak to the fact that they had all these songs they had to get out. And I think that there was a mercenary side to it where they had a contract where this is one less album owed. So that was in their minds, and that's been reported. But it also offered George Harrison more of an outlet as well. And maybe he should have had 5 songs on the album instead of 4. But John and Paul were just absolutely prolific and just had the vision to see how these songs should be arranged, and they got them done.
Yeah. I think it's become my favourite, but I don't think that's at all objective. You know, some people would place a couple of the early albums as their favourite, you know, and who's to say they're wrong? They're absolutely not wrong. I think when that box set came out in the 50th anniversary, I think all the extras that were on it, it was just so overwhelming for me that I had a get of a light bulb moment, I suppose. They're obviously playing quite well as well. They were always like a little bit ropey. I mean, George Harrison famously said, "Oh, we're just a bunch of crummy musicians." And you kind of know what he means. What he means is that they're playing, if you compare it to, I don't know, the members of the Cream, for example. They weren't in the same class, you know.
Not at all. And in 1968, you had this huge step forward of the guitar heroes. You know, the Claptons, the Becks, the Hendricks. And this was all brewing for a couple of years, but it really came to the fore. And the Beatles, I've been doing a lot of listening to the deconstructed tracks that people have separated, the vocals and the instrumentation and everything. And I was very surprised to hear some of the Beatles' instrumentation and the sloppiness, the mistakes, and they were not session-level quality. They were not virtuosos, including McCartney. No way. I mean, his bass playing is very sloppy. But the thing is again, the Beatles playing, when put together and produced properly, I mean, it just sounds incredibly great. I mean, it's those little flaws that you can't really even hear them in the final mix, but they do add up to something really special. So I think I can understand what George Harrison was saying. You know, you start hanging out with guys like Clapton. I mean, it had to be humbling for him. But it's with Clapton. You know, it's okay to be humbled by that guy.
Absolutely, yeah. When I used to listen to the White Album, it was quite late in because I didn't listen to the albums chronologically. I had this sort of 2 or 3 year period of immersion between the ages of about 14 and 17. I just was lapping it up. There were interviews, outtakes, everything, as much as I could get. And it was one of the later ones, and it didn't grab me initially, because it's not as accessible as, you know, Hard Day's Night or Rubber Soul. But I did always used to find it spooky. I always liked to listen to it late at night for some reason on headphones. And then when I kind of cracked it with Revolution 9, I started to really appreciate it because I saw this breakdown. I covered this on the episode I did, but very early version of the internet. And I kind of got that. So there was always a bit of a spookiness, particularly to side 4. But I think those sessions, I think they had a bit of drama and they had a bit of comedy. They were almost like a bit of a microcosm of the Beatles. And they were so long, of course, you know, however long it was, 4 months, 5 months. While all this is going on, I wanted to highlight one particular day, which is June the 6th, because this is John Lennon to a T. I don't know which came first, but he did an interview along with Victor Spinetti. I think it was the National Theatre were doing a production based on his books in his own right and Spanish in the works. And Spinetti was involved with that. John Lennon famously cried when he went to the rehearsal because it had moved him so much, because it reminded him of his childhood, which obviously it's a lot of his childhood in the books. They did this interview where it's famously John Lennon, there's a clip online of John Lennon saying, "I think our leaders are insane. You know, if you could tell me what they think they're achieving, I'd love to know." And I go along with that. But then the same day, I'm sure you've heard this, the interview they did with Kenny Everett in Studio 2.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one, yeah.
And that's John Lennon. That's the same day, according to Chip Badinger's book, Lennonology. So you've got these sort of effortless juxtaposition of two John Lennons, the serious intellectual guy who's quite switched on politically, and then the pure comedy.
Yeah, that interview, Lennon, he's being somewhat overly comedic to kind of not answer serious questions. And maybe he had enough of that with the other interview.
I think Kenny Everett was a sort of a safe space where he could just be anarchic.
First a few questions, then I'd like you to sing me a jingle, a goodbye jingle.
Okay, goodbye jingle.
Oh yeah, what can we expect from you in the next few months? I've heard you're working on it.
A lot of brown paper bags, Kenny, actually.
Yeah.
We're working very hard on that at the moment. Poison Me.
Anything tuney?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of tunes to be found in the bags actually.
I got told that you don't actually come in here with the idea of doing an album, it just sort of falls out of one of the sessions.
Well, we have a vague idea, you know, Ken?
Yes.
As I was only saying the other day, we had a vague idea, but very vague. Also, very vague. Just a bit of laughter, ladies and gentlephones.
Have you done any actual complete numbers?
No. We're halfway through the second incomplete number now.
Yeah. You don't actually do them whole complete and then finish with them and then start another one?
See, like, we've got to a stage with one where the next bit is musicians, so we'll have to write the musicians bit, you see. Oh, you see.
Do you ever get to, you've done your bit and you decide it would be good on its own and then forget the musician?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody stole my gown. Somebody stole my gown.
Can you sing me a goodbye jingle?
Okay.
It doesn't have to rhyme.
Goodbye jingle, goodbye jingle, goodbye, goodbye jingle, goodbye jingle, goodbye.
When you produce something of such a high standard as your last album undoubtedly was...
High standard.
High standard. Don't you think that you've really got to strive, like...
No.
To produce something a little bit better?
It only got high because everybody said how high it was. It's no higher than it was when we made it.
Yes. The hidden meanings on that one, ladies and gentlemen.
No, what I mean, Kenny, is that it doesn't pose a problem to us. It was so long ago we've forgotten what it was about anyway. And let me put it this way.
That's it.
We've obviously got the start of John and Yoko publicly. They plant the acorns outside Coventry Cathedral. That's mid-June. He takes her to the opening. It was actually the Old Vic, the theatre adaptation of his books. I think that's the one where people are saying, "Where's your wife, John?" There's a new exhibit called You Are Here, to Yoko from John with love. You know, the events are coming thick and fast. There's a Yellow Submarine premiere. John and Yoko's stay at Cavendish. Have you heard of this you and your Jap tart are hot shit thing?
Oh, yeah, you're referring to, so John Lennon and Yoko Ono move in with Paul McCartney.
Temporarily, yeah.
And McCartney had recently broken up with Jane Asher, or she had broken it off with him, the engagement. There was a postcard that was addressed to John Lennon that said that you and your Jap tart think you're such hot shit, and then McCartney supposedly admitted to sending it as this kind of a joke. And this came out of the book, Francis Schwartz's book, Body Count. I don't believe that that is accurate. And the reason I don't really buy that is because Lennon, when he went in his anti-McCartney direction for all those years, and he was blaming the Beatles and their friends for not treating him and Yoko well or treating Yoko shabbily, Lennon never brought this up. Never. And he brought up everything else ad nauseum and overplayed stuff. This is one thing he would have brought up. And Francis Schwartz's book was published by, there's a Jan Wenner connection to that publisher. It had to do with the Rolling Stones. So I'm not buying that at all. But there could have been a postcard sent to them like that, but didn't have any McCartney significance at all or any connection to him at all.
I don't know. I haven't read Francis Schwartz's book. I honestly couldn't tell you.
Can you imagine those four in the same house, though? Here you have McCartney just being jilted by Jane Asher. Apparently that was more traumatic than he really let on. I think he went through a period of really partying pretty hard during this time. This was the White Album recording. Francis Schwartz was not exactly marrying material, shall we say. And then Lennon's with Yoko. So I think it might have been, they're all kind of partying a bit as well during this time. Which is strange because Ringo and George were not really doing that. They're coming from a different perspective and they're all recording the White Album at the same time. Very weird personal lives going on.
That's what I mean. It's just a fascinating psychodrama. But yeah, it's amazing how quickly. We say that John Lennon's life changes quickly every few months or whatever, every year. They've been to India. It's Paul and Jane and John and Sin. And then suddenly it's John and Yoko and Paul and Francie. And then soon it'll be Paul and Linda. Now, a book that you and I have both reviewed on our separate shows, Riding So High. Very, very good book by Joe Gooden. In it, I'm not sure if it's 68 or 67, but Paul apparently has a jar of cocaine in his house. And Brian Jones apparently keeps turning up and stealing it or something.
I had to be in swing in London.
God, absolutely, yeah. I'd have been there. So I think Paul has said that Cavendish Avenue is kind of open house and Famously, you get the guy, forerunner of John Lennon, who came in to Paul and said, "Oh, I'm Jesus," and Paul said, "Oh, you better come in," and invited him to one of the Sgt. Pepper sessions. So you couldn't make it up.
It was Beatlemania. Some guy shows up at your house who calls himself Jesus.
Yeah.
And instead of calling the police, you invite him into the studio.
Yeah.
Don't you think that's crazy?
It didn't seem crazy at the time. The thing is, what would happen is people would show up at my house.
At your door.
At the door.
No security.
And it wasn't those days.
Right.
Those days,
it's hard
you
to
didn't
imagine.
think like that,
Yeah.
And I would just be... If I had something going on, I would say, sorry, he's not in or whatever, But in this case, I didn't. And I just went out to the door and said, yeah, what do you want? And he's sort of just a kind of bearded guy. And he said, I'm Jesus. I said, you better come in.
Really?
You want a cup of tea? I thought, so I just started chatting to him. And I thought, he's probably not Jesus. He's probably
schizophrenic.
Hippie, maybe schizophrenic. But I thought, you never know.
Right.
And I'm not going to say, go away, Jesus.
That's so true.
So I called him in, and then I said, well, look, I've got this session.
Yeah.
And if you want, you can come and hang out there. So I came into the guys and so I said, look, he says he's Jesus. Now, I don't know if he is or isn't.
Right.
But I'm not going to take any chances here. Is it okay if he just sits in the corner? And I said to him, don't say a word. Just be Jesus.
So, John and Yoko are staying with Paul. July 26th, John helps Paul finish off Hey Jude in the Cavendish Music Room. And that night, I was just saying to you earlier, Paul is seen out with Francie Schwartz at a place called Revolution, I think. Could there be a place called Revolution? Maybe. He's seen out with her in a nightclub. Jane Ashwood actually announced the end of her engagement to him 6 days earlier, July the 20th. And then a couple more things in July. They had the Mad Day Out photo session. Mm-hmm. Brilliant photos. One of interest is the John Lennon death photo. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all around him.
Yeah, kind of odd. It's weird.
It is, but I mean, it's the second weird thing that's happened with that, because if you've seen How I Won the War, John Lennon gets shot, I think, in the stomach, and he has a death scene in that film as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it fits this sort of profile. I think death was a fascinating thing for him, because he'd suffered a lot of it, so it was an awful thing for him. He'd had all these people die on him, as he said, but I feel like with his personality, there was probably a bit of a fascination as well. I don't think he ever strayed away from dark materials, Mm-hmm. And the final thing in July is the Apple Boutique closes, and of course the Beatles come in the night before it closes, or the day before it closes, and they take whatever they get it, and Paul says, I got a smashing overcoat or something like that. So they kind of raid the shop, and then the last 2 days of July, the stock is given away and the public raids the shop. So it's all, it's all highly surreal. Apple, of course, has carried on, and Neil Aspinall became president. Have you read The Longest Cocktail Party?
Oh, it's been many years. I got to reread that one. That's one I've got to buy. I've got to buy that one and add that to my library permanently.
Yeah, me too. I've read it once. Richard DeLello, isn't it? The house hippie. I just remember it being fantastic. That was an office building unlike any other. And as you said earlier, Derek Taylor was in the thick of it. There's pre-rolled joints in the office and bottles of scotch, and I mean,
it's just party central. I mean, very high level, very high end, expensive drugs and booze. And it was a party. I mean, you're not going to be able to run a business very well on that. And it wasn't run well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they were sort of kind of enjoying it and didn't really know what they'd let themselves in for, I don't think. I don't think they really understood capitalism and big business at the highest level, how ruthless it is, I mean, I remember the movie Trading Places, with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, and at the end, if you remember, they managed to cheat the Duke brothers, the two old capitalist big business guys. And as they're about to go into the Wall Street, Eddie Murphy's character obviously comes from the streets. It's probably seen a bit of violence. Dan Aykroyd said, if you think life on the streets is ruthless and immoral, wait till you get up there, mate,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no kidding.
Not in so many words, I'm paraphrasing, but the idea is that big business can be, just as ruthless, immoral, and I think they just didn't really know what they let themselves in for. And then just one more thing, actually, in July, I think this was the 29th as well, the Beatles are filmed recording Hey Jude, which is one of the first Beatles things I ever saw in my fandom.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And famously, George Harrison's in the control room with George Martin because he'd come up with this guitar part of answering the phrases, and Paul had said, not too happy with that. So George just, quote-unquote, relegated to the control room.
Yeah, there is some footage with George playing with the others, and then there's actually video of Paul and him talking, and you wonder if that was the discussion, but then you see him later in the control room. Yeah, great song. What a great song.
Yeah, of course. We'll get to the release of that soon. Okay, and then we are into August, and things slow down slightly. That's slow down in Beatles land, not slow down by any normal standards. August the 6th. We think it's August the 6th, not actually sure. The opening of the Vesuvio Club in Tottenham Court Road. Now, this is memorable for a couple of reasons. I've actually just bought, and I haven't started reading it again, but I read many years ago that book by Tony Sanchez.
Spanish Tony, the heroin connection for the Stones. And John and Yoko for a while, yeah.
Yeah, it's called Up and Down with the Rolling Stones. I have just skimmed through a bit of it, but I've got a feeling I've read it. I think I've read it already. It's one of those ones where you start reading and you think, yeah, I read this 25 years ago. I don't remember anything. So the Stones were involved with this Vesuvio Club, and it was also Mick Jagger's 25th birthday, and Beggar's Banquet, I think, was just about to come out. What I've got here, according to Spanish Tony Sanchez, there was a punch that was spiked with mescaline, which is a hallucinogen, and there were hash cakes and hash pipes just laid on for the guests, which sounds like a really good idea. I'm sure when they walked in they thought that's a great idea, but if everyone in the party is on mescaline punch, which is almost the plot of Gaspar Noé's latest film, if you've heard of him, he's like a French filmmaker.
No, I have not.
He did a film called Climax a few years ago. That's basically the story. It's a load of dancers, and someone puts acid in the punch. So this whole dance troupe, everyone is on acid. Anyway, and the other thing that happens is, well, John Lennon's there, and then Paul arrives with the acetate of Hey Jude and Revolution, which is about to come out, and sticks it on the turntable, and according to some accounts, everyone goes, wow, you know, it's Hey Jude, and then the long fade out, and then they hear Revolution, John Lennon's nasal vocal of Revolution. And I've got here John Lennon, quote, looking like his eyes were going to pop out of his head, leaves the party, and everyone in the party is stoned on mescaline or hash or both. He can't get a cab or something, and Mick Jagger gives him the keys to his E-Type Jag, classic car. And then John drops his coke on the floor, and a policeman comes. But because he's John Lennon, the policeman just says, oh, hi, John, how you doing? I like your latest record, or something like that. So John Lennon basically just leaves and says to the guy, not the policeman, the other guy, if you find my coke, you can keep it, or something.
Yeah, Lennon was incredibly paranoid leaving that party because he was always rather paranoid about the cops. For all the tough guy stuff you hear of his early days, he wanted nothing to do with the cops. He was a turn-tail and run guy. And that party, everybody was pretty stoned. I remember Marianne Faithfull saying that. I believe that the Stones put on the song Sympathy for the Devil, which had a really positive response. And McCartney goes and by the DJ says, hey, buddy, put this on. And then the Beatles totally upstaged Mick Jagger at his own birthday party by playing Revolution and Hey Jude, and the crowd goes wild.
Yeah.
But I think that is just classic, how the Stones are always two steps behind and a couple of dollars short of the Beatles up until the breakup of the Beatles when the Stones finally were able to blossom.
We don't know, what Paul's motive was exactly, but I listened to Nothing Is Real. That's a really good podcast. I think I mentioned that earlier. And they said Paul has a habit of dropping into places with his latest acetate or playing his latest song.
The Beatles had a little thing with the Stones. Even George Harrison in the anthology, I loved when he said, Mick Jagger was always lurking about trying to figure out what the Fabs were up to. In fact, Harrison went so far as to say the drug bust in '67 that the cops waited for him to leave before they busted Keith Richards, which we know now is not true. But anyway, Harrison, I think, was well known in the Beatles camp about the pecking order. So I think McCartney was just exercising that pecking order a little bit. Much to Lennon's delight, I'm sure.
Yeah, I bet. We don't know what he thought about that, but it sounds like he was a bit off it that night, so maybe he didn't react. But the other quote from Tony Sanchez, John, I feared, was following Brian Jones into a world where drugs dominated everything. And then he lists off, coke, LSD, heroin.
Yeah, thanks to Tony Sanchez. I mean, that was his business, Yeah. It's interesting because Jones was almost utterly useless for the last 2 years he was with the Stones, with some minor exceptions. You can't say that about Lennon.
Oh, sure.
Which is quite different. So I don't know why. Obviously, I think when he partied with the Stones, I think he let loose a little bit more than normal just based on some of the Keith Richards quotes.
Yeah, tell me that thing that you were telling me off mic just before about him going to Keith Richards' house and...
Yeah, this was also in '68, about this time when John Lennon and Yoko Ono were at Keith Richards' house. There was a party, and Lennon was completely drunk and stoned, and basically Yoko had to like take him home, and she sounded like the wife, the caretaker, like, why did you give him so much, Keith? And Keith is like, well, whatever,
Yeah.
And Lennon had to be dragged out. Keith Richards, he takes some delight in calling John Lennon somewhat of a lightweight. Not only with drinks, but drugs as well. But that's just, Richards, he considers himself a pedigree drug taker and knowing how to do it well. There's a little bit of that as well, but it's still a funny story, and poor Yoko had to, get him out of there.
Yeah, because in the Keith Richards book, Life, which I read a few years ago, he said something along those lines. John would be throwing up on the stairs or something, and Keith would go, yeah, well, I did warn you, mate. Because I think Keith's constitution is quite legendary, and there's lots of reports, There was even that meme that went around to do with COVID, and it's Keith Richards just going, oh, where's everyone gone? The rest of the world all died from COVID, and he's the only one standing.
Yeah, the meme I had, just use some of my blood to make the antidote,
Yeah, or that thing about the coming environmental crisis. We have to think about what world we're going to leave for Keith Richards.
Yeah, exactly. There's a more recent video with Keith Richards talking about John Lennon, saying, I think John wanted to be a Rolling Stone once in a while. To leave the Beatles in the party sense, to just hang out with the Stones and just let loose in a different way, where he's not the kind of the leader guy. He's just the
one of the boys.
He's the Brian Jones, basically.
But in terms of hardiness and constitution, I think John was behind Keith, but he was ahead of Brian Jones. I think Brian Jones, I don't know if I was saying earlier about drinking and drugs, like when you're under the influence and it's the wrong type of drugs, like, coke or alcohol, I think someone like Brian Jones did some pretty awful things, and he couldn't handle it.
Yeah, it has to do with your mental constitution as well. Brian Jones had some, I forget what they called it, but I think he had some kind of clinical depression. Like many of these casualties of the 60s drug culture, Skip Spence and Syd Barrett and Brian Wilson for sure, all had some issues, mental issues that combined with this type of drug taking did not go well. And Brian Jones, I think, probably is in there as well.
Yep. Okay. Very interesting. A couple of days later, again, these dates are a tiny bit contentious, but I think within a few days we know. August the 8th, Paul is with Francie Schwartz. They apparently just come out of EMI Studios. They've been working on Not Guilty until the early hours. Paul McCartney's American girlfriend, Francie Schwartz, decided to go to the Apple boutique, which was closed down, which is what we talked about just before, and paint Hey Jude and Revolution across its large whitewashed shop windows. The words were mistaken for anti-Semitic graffiti, since Jude means Jew in German, leading to complaints from the local Jewish community and the windows being smashed by a passerby. That was interesting, actually, because for one reason that I didn't realise from doing this research, Francie Schwartz was around for so long, or that Linda wasn't around. I think we talked about this earlier. When did Paul and Linda actually get together? When did he stop sowing his wild oats? I don't think he had any bad intentions about this Hey Jude thing. I think it was just literally, it seemed like a good idea. Just paint Hey Jude and Revolution. They're probably proud of the single,
Yeah, I mean, the Beatles right now, they were really understanding marketing because, Lennon was about to embark on all this stuff with Yoko Ono. McCartney's using the empty storefront to promote the latest single. I mean, these guys were kind of plugged in. Apple had been started. So that was the mentality. I mean,
sure.
McCartney obviously is not anti-Semitic.
Okay, just to jump forward a couple of weeks, 23rd of August, Cynthia Lennon announces that she's filed for divorce. We won't go into all that Magic Alex stuff now. I'd like to, but it's just we've got so much to cover. One of the books, I think it's the Peter Brown book, they actually said that Cynthia slept with Magic Alex. And then her account is that they got drunk and he tried to seduce her and she wasn't interested. But anyway. And then the next day, the 24th, John and Yoko go on the David Frost show. I'm sure you've seen that clip. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have. Their first TV appearance together. If you remember, when he announces them, he says, oh, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and they kind of peep their heads round the corner. So this is very much childlike John. Do you remember I was saying earlier with that tape of Yoko talking when they were doing Revolution? She sounds like a little girl, which I kind of find charming. And they're very much playing the kind of playful, because the psychedelic movement, we've talked about this on the show, there was a big difference between the British and American. The American psychedelic movement was a bit more adult, for want of a better word. And the British psychedelic movement was sort of Daisy Chains and Alice in Wonderland and Return to Childhood.
Yes.
And I feel like even though this is 68, okay, it's not so much psychedelia, but they had that thing, I think, when they met, Victor Spinetti said it's like if someone said to you, here's a box of crayons, let's paint something. It's that return to childhood innocence, which I think John really got a lot from Yoko. But do you remember much about this appearance? How do you think they come across?
I don't remember a whole lot, but I do remember that peeking around the corner and that kind of, John saying, I've been a bad little boy. I'm kind of hiding. I'm here coming out with Yoko for the first time. I thought that's kind of what that was about. The childishness of the psychedelic period always kind of bothered me. I mean, they took it to such a ridiculous extent in some cases, like bands called the Pink Fairies, and there's all this dancing gnomes and all this fantasy type of stuff that in America just wasn't. It was just more. It does seem more adult. The whole San Francisco thing maybe it was the California vibe that just was warmer and sunnier. But I don't remember a whole lot about that interview, other than it must have been kind of a shock to people to see him with another woman publicly and on television. And obviously Yoko Ono started to bear the brunt of, some call it racism, but I think she's the other woman. Because everybody liked Cynthia. She was in the background, but it seemed like the Beatles were starting to get outside of accepted norms. And that would really bear out in the coming months.
Absolutely. Well, I think the point to be made really is the attachment people had to Beatle John and to the Beatles that the public had. A lot of racism actually just comes from ignorance or fear, because xenophobia literally means fear of foreigners, doesn't it, rather than hatred. And you've got to remember as well that because there wasn't the same media landscape, it probably seemed quite intense for then, but compared to now, I mean, people probably hadn't seen him for months, because the other thing, he looked really different as well, didn't he? He looked thinner. Mm-hmm. Suddenly he's got long hair. I guess he had the glasses the year before, but long hair, middle parted long hair. He kind of looks a bit like Yoko. They do that thing where they start to look very similar. David Frost was kind of nice with it. He was kind of humouring them a little bit. Wasn't patronising them too much.
Is the sculpture then the broken cup, or the way people rebuild it?
Well, the thing is, there's no such thing as sculpture or art, and it's just words, Mm-hmm. I'm actually saying everything is art, and we're all art. Art is just a tag, like a journalist tag, but artists believe it. And that sculpture is anything, you care to name it. This is sculpture, us sitting here. This is a happening. Yeah. We are here.
I don't think it's
This is art, yeah. So, I mean, if you gave that to a child, he wouldn't have any preconceived ideas, so you wouldn't have to say, this is sculpture, or this is a broken cup. You'd say, there's that, there's glue. What do? You stick it together. I enjoy imagining doing things just as much, don't you? I mean, you imagine a meal, you imagine sex, you imagine a holiday, and it's nearly as good as the actual thing.
In all cases, the real thing's much better.
My memories of holidays, even on a holiday that wasn't so good, I remember the good bit, it's just like that. And if you imagine it, it's all good.
Wonderful. Thank you. But, I mean, if imaginary things are as good as real things, then...
No, I didn't say that. I
things
said
not almost as good. Do things, therefore, not matter at all? Is it all in the mind?
Well, I don't know. That's what they keep saying. That's what George's cartoon kept saying in Yellow Submarine. It's all in the mind, groovy, and all that. But it probably is all in the mind, but I don't know. You're only awake when you realise you're awake. And when you're dreaming, whatever happens is just as real. Whether you actually do die in a dream or fulfill whatever you're doing in a dream. And there's nobody to tell me that it isn't as real as this now. Because how do you know,
If you had to summarise, I mean, we've the last got about a minute to go. How could you, it's amazing, but how could you summarise what you want to get across to our people? Have the vibrations changed?
A little, yes. I think maybe it's got confusing with this, because we're not all that articulate, and it's nerve-wracking being on TV and trying to explain yourself. We try and explain ourselves in what we do, and I do it mainly through music, and she does it through her art like that. And it's hard to put words to it.
They do this thing where they hammer a nail in, and you're supposed to kind of feel transcendent when you're doing it. But my question to you is, do you think John and Yoko were actually naive about these things? Surely, like John Lennon, we've said before, was kind of naive and streetwise at the same time. They must have known what reaction they're going to get, right?
That's a good question. I've always thought that Lennon, we know how much he flip-flops in life just on topics, on politics, on religion. It seems to be this is another thing he flip-flops on, where he's sometimes he seems to know that what he's doing is to be taken not seriously. But on the other side, he simplifies it to a point where it can be taken seriously. I always thought that was the interesting thing about him during this time. So that's how I always looked at him during this time.
When I was watching that, because I was just watching it again the other day, that hammering a nail thing, David Frost says quite nicely, he just says, I kind of just felt like a guy hammering a nail. Like, he's sort of speaking for the masses who are going to say, well, if you ask me to hammer a nail in, I'm not going to necessarily feel anything transcendent. I'm just hammering a nail. I think I kind of like it just because it's just sort of planting an alternative idea that something very mundane can have a sort of magic about it, if you like. The other thing is that I've always had a soft spot for conceptual art and performance art. So that's why I've always kind of warmed to Yoko. Not necessarily the screaming, but, the cut piece, the famous thing where people can come in the audience and snip a piece of clothing off her. I mean, I think that's brilliant. It's such a great idea. And I quite like Grapefruit, her book as well. So I kind of warmed to that. Obviously, I don't think they're naive enough to think that people are going to take it at face value. But I think it's just planting a seed, which, of course, literally they did at Coventry Cathedral. They literally planted seeds. But I think that's what they're doing. And then 2 days later, we have a very big event, which is the birth of Matt Williamson. And there's some other thing, the Hey Jude and Revolution single, but we don't need to talk about that. When did you realise that you were born on the same day that Hey Jude and Revolution came out?
Oh, it probably wasn't until I was maybe in my early 30s. It was a long time. It took a long time for us to get this kind of information on recording dates and release dates. I mean, it was really probably internet time right in there, maybe a little before in some publication.
So Hey Jude, Revolution. Okay, well, I guess the question here is, where does that stack up with their greatest singles? If you take into account the A and B side, where would you place it?
I rate this very high. I did a video on the Beatles' 10 best songs, and it's very hard for people to actually do that without including what their favorites are. It's two very different things. So the reason I considered Hey Jude one of their best songs is because, to me, it epitomizes what a lot of Beatles songs are. It's a simple song, it's a beautiful melody, and it invites you to join them and sing. It's a great connection. And the fade out where it's just not anybody can sing that, and it's catchy, and it gets in your head. And when they do it on the Frost Show, they literally invite all those people up, and they crowd around them, and that's a really great moment. I really like that moment. One of my best memories of the late Beatle period is that part of Hey Jude, when everybody runs up and joins them. I mean, it's just absolutely a joyous song.
Yeah, I mean, Revolution as a B-side. I remember once I was at a party in my teens or my 20s, and I was just becoming a Beatles fan. And my friend, he was having a party, and he had like a really amazing stereo system, the like of which I'd never seen. And we had, it was CDs in those days. I thought, I'll stick Revolution, I'll turn it really loud. And it shook the whole house, and he went apeshit. But I could also feel the impact when that guitar comes in at the beginning of Revolution. And we know actually from another podcast I listened to years ago that's actually very similar to a song that already existed. Almost exactly the same guitar part. But anyway, John Lennon made it his own. The impact of that, when that crashes in, also the contrast between the two songs, I think it's well up there. You could easily call it their greatest single. Maybe Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, which is a double A side, be up there. In those days, I think there was an art to sort of A and B sides as well. They would perhaps be an alternative to each other. Of course, then we got CD singles and there's 4 or 5 songs. And you kind of lost that A-B thing.
Yeah, the Beatles seem to handle the A-B sides better than most, even with bands that had good material. And there was an art to understanding what to put on that B-side. The Beatles had just a embarrassment of riches, and I'll take Revolution as a B-side anytime.
Oh, yeah. I guess Rain would be up there as greatest B-sides as well.
One last thing about Hey Jude is I think that when you see the crowd join in, the song obviously has got a build-up, and it kind of reaches a climax. And not a lot of Beatles songs are really designed that way. And I think it was, I don't know if that was intentional, but it's kind of a slow build, and then you've got this big, I don't want to say orgasmic release, but it's like that's what kind of I was going. And that's why I think that song works so well.
Yeah, I just like the relentlessness of it. And when the orchestra comes in with that note, they hit the na-na-na-na. One of the orchestra instruments hits that note, and that's when it really comes alive. And then you got the ad-libs and everything. But it's just that power of a choral thing. So if you play that really loud as well, it has a different effect than Revolution does. But both of them played at sort of loud volume. They have a magic about them. And then you get the Beatles obviously playing Revolution. Someone on YouTube, lip read, George says something like, John's mic is shit. When you see George smiling and saying something, that's apparently what he says.
Yeah.
And then you get this interesting thing where they do the shooby-doo-up. They do the backing vocals from the slow version, which doesn't really fit. But again, it's just the Beatles being one step ahead and thinking, oh, why don't we do that? That'd be fun, you know.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I liked that. It ad-libbed. It seemed ad-libbed and was at least gives us another version. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, and the Beatles rocking out and proving that they could still rock out completely.
Mm-hmm.
September the 30th, the Authorized biography is published. Still the only authorized biography. I should read it again. It's been a long, long time. But it was interesting with that he started in 66, and if you think about the changes that they went through just in the 2 years, It was almost, in a funny way, out of date before it was published, although I think on the early stuff, it was great, you know, the Liverpool stuff, because that hadn't changed, but the 2 years he was working on it just saw such a profound change.
Do you know when it goes up to? Does it make it into 68?
It does make it into 68, because there's that really chilling, he paints a really chilling scene of life at Kenwood with John and Cynthia. They're all sort of sitting there in silence. When was the last time you read that?
Oh, I've never read it cover to cover. In fact, it was a library book back when I was younger, and I just bought it about a year and a half ago, and it's been sitting on my shelf. So it's on my list to read.
Yeah, you should do it once. Yeah, just plow through the whole thing, because it's pretty interesting. October the 16th to October the 17th, we get the one and only 24-hour Beatles session. I'm sure you've all heard about that. Wednesday the 16th to Thursday the 17th, approximately 5 p.m. to 5 p.m. Apparently it's only John and Paul and the engineers, and obviously everyone by the end of it is falling asleep, and they did all the sequencing and the crossfades and everything. Bizarrely, on the same day, I don't know if it was the Wednesday or the Thursday, the Beatles and Tony Barrow parted company. This is another thing like that Cavern thing we had earlier, that sort of break from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Tony Barrow wrote the liner notes and was a publicity guy. And then actually, before we get to the next day, let's talk about the White Album as an album. Now, I've decided over the last few years that I think the White Album is my favourite Beatles album, and partly it's almost like a kind of a desert island pick, because if I was on a desert island, it's the one that's got the most on it, because it's double the length. But also, it's got that spooky thing that we did talk about earlier when we were talking about the sessions.
There's no other album like it. I think that it catches the Beatles in one of the most interesting moods. Post-India, John leaving Cynthia behind, and Paul, the same thing with Jane Asher. Harrison's spirituality, coming back from India, and, you know, kind of going probably very hopeful, coming back, hopes dashed. Ringo's Ringo, though he left the sessions, which was very unusual, and we don't really get a good understanding of why he left the sessions. What he gave us in the anthology was pretty glossed over. And then the old stories, I went to the others, I'm leaving the band, and they said, I thought it was you three that were tight. I think that part is good because it shows this paranoia, which is accentuated by drug use. So it's unsettling times. Things were becoming unraveled here. Not only was culture breaking down around them, but they were breaking down from within. This paranoia was setting in, and they were just outgrowing themselves and the Beatles, apparently.
Yeah, that story of Ringo's from the anthology is a good one, because it probably didn't happen literally, as you said, but it probably is more or less accurate, that they were in a group of four. The idea that everyone of them all thinking that they're the odd one out, because that can happen in a group of guys, you know. One of the reasons I like the White Album, I think it's always had that spooky quality, but I think the amount of tumult around. 68, you've got drugs, pressure, musical differences and fame happening to all those people, plus Yoko, plus Paul's complicated love life, and Linda's on the periphery there somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's such an incredible thing. And, of course, the aspect of should it be in a single album, it doesn't really matter, because now we can make our own single albums. We can make our own playlist. But I think the fact that it's such a jumble is perfect, because that's what the Beatles were at that time, a jumble of musical ideas and a jumble of kind of a mess, really. That's what was happening to them.
But some of their finest works, and as Ringo also said in the anthology, which goes against the narrative that they were breaking up and it was like a solo album they're backing, so we know that that's a load of crap. because they had a deadline to get this album done. They wanted it out before Christmas for sure. And, Ringo was probably being pulled in every direction to complete these tracks, which is maybe why he got frustrated. But Ringo said, hey, we were playing together as a band again. Unlike the Pepper years where you had all this overdubbing and orchestral stuff, they went away from that completely.
Yeah, this is the thing I've really never understood about the White Album, or what people say about it. They say on the one hand it was the least group unity, but then they say they were playing together as a band.
Well, the Beatles say they were playing together as a band. Here's one thing. In America, I can give you an answer why that is, because the classic rock radio format that came out in the mid-'80s and pretty much took over the country as far as programming goes, every 2-bit DJ had a little card that said one sentence about the song, and every one of them said this was like 4 solo records, and they were guesting as backing musicians on everybody else. So that got ingrained into the collective radio listening population. And I know that because I heard it everywhere, and by people who were not so far from it. All they were doing is reading, and most listeners do nothing but mimic what they hear anyway. So that's how that got to be. You can't make an album like the White Album, like Happiness is a Warm Gun, or Birthday, or Dear Prudence without Ringo. These guys were pulling together. I don't care what anybody says. You can't make music like that unless you pull together and work as a unit.
Yeah, plus this thing, I mean, I've been in quite a few bands, and this thing about being a sideman for the rest, well, they made an agreement, and a lot of bands do this. The person that writes the song tends to direct things. So at what point do the others, are they more than sidemen? Because sidemen is just a word, isn't it? It's a derogatory word. Oh, you're just a sideman. But otherwise, then you get the messy thing about, oh, someone's writing the song. Like if we take And I Love Her, which I think is answered by I Me Mine, because Paul came up with the faster bit of I Me Mine. Then, okay, he's not a sideman, then he can claim writing credit. It gets very messy, so I just don't buy this thing. And the other thing, maybe a myth that we could smash, this thing about them using multiple studios at the same time. I have it on fairly good authority that was partly a practical thing, because they were on a deadline. And yeah, I'm sure John did get a bit hurt when Paul went off and did Why Don't We Do It in the Road, which I actually think is brilliant as a concept. It's like I Want You, She's So Heavy, or You Know My Name. It's just a single line.
Yeah, I think another thing to bring up that's very important when understanding the White Album sessions is that the Beatles were essentially producing themselves. So this idea, whoever song it was, that was who arranged it. Obviously, in the early days, George Martin was the boss. He was the arranger. Didn't matter whose song it was. So by 1967, and certainly by this time, when Martin left because he couldn't probably take it anymore, because the Beatles were being a little bit testy with him. They're bossing him around now. He went on vacation. Chris Thomas took over, who they could push around. So I think that the idea that this backing musician type of thing came from as a result of them producing themselves.
I think they were all well capable, aren't they? Because George was already producing Apple artists, and Paul was as well.
They took good notes under George Martin. They learned a lot from him, I think, and those engineers as well.
Yeah, I guess Abbey Road was the time when he came back, wasn't it, and fulfilled something like his traditional role.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I mean, there's a million other things we could say about the White Album, obviously, but many people have spoken about it before, and many people will in the future, I'm sure. I did want to point out one thing that's very interesting when you actually look at the dates of the chronology of a certain year. So this 24-hour session that we talked about was Wednesday, October the 16th to Thursday, October the 17th, 5 p.m. to 5 p.m., and then October the 18th, the Friday morning, John and Yoko get busted at Montague Square. You know, it's very interesting to John Lennon to go from one completely different area of his life, which is the Beatles, and his professional life. He probably didn't get much sleep, but apparently John Lennon could stay up for days. I don't know if that was to do with drugs or something else, or both. So he gets busted at Montague Square. Now, do you know the history of this flat? Because it did have quite a history.
Only person I know was Hendrix living there at one time.
Yeah, Hendrix lived there. I don't know when Ringo actually took it over, but Hendrix was there. Paul McCartney did some spoken word stuff with William Burroughs. So again, not only was Paul sort of in there first with a lot of the avant-garde stuff, he even did stuff at Montague Square before John, which is interesting. And then when John and Yoko moved into Kenwood together, which we said I think was the end of May when we were talking earlier, Cynthia and Julian went to live at Montague Square, and then they swapped at some point. So then Cyn and Julian went to Kenwood, and John and Yoko went to Montague Square. So Montague Square had Paul doing stuff, Jimi Hendrix, Cynthia and Julian, and then John and Yoko. So they get busted. We know John had apparently clean the flat out. This will obviously have huge ramifications. We've already covered actually 1972, and we covered the US versus John Lennon as well in a previous episode. But have you seen the footage of them?
Yeah, I have seen some of the footage, and it was used for the Life of the Lions album cover as well, which is very appropriate. The time in England, it just seems like everything was just going awry. The whole counterculture was just, in the view of a lot of people, probably going too far. And I think, obviously, Pilcher, the guy who in charge, I don't remember what his rank was.
Sergeant, I think.
Sergeant Pilcher, yeah. So obviously there was some planting of evidence going on to drive the point home, and there was this back and forth between the counterculture and the establishment, the press, and I guess the police, which started really with the Stones and some of the goings on there, where the Stones really showed up with the press. The press screwed up in identifying the wrong Stone, which happened to be Mick Jagger. So I think this is just ramifications of this whole thing in London that just seemed to be this fight, and it started getting unfair.
Yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of this relationship with the press and everything, but Don Short, who was a guy they knew very well from the press, apparently did tip John Lennon off. He rang him up, and then obviously the police arrive. I don't know what point the establishment turned on them especially, but Sergeant Pilcher, it's quite bizarre that it sounds a bit like Sergeant Pepper as well, though, isn't it? If we needed any other weird coincidences. He obviously observed the pecking order we were talking about earlier, because he busted the Stones, well, Donovan first, and then the Stones, and then John and Yoko, and then George. And I told the story, I won't tell the full story, but when George was busted, Patty was at home. George came home to find George came home to find the police in his living room listening to Beatles records, which is quite funny. And then early November, Yoko is admitted to the Queen Charlotte's Hospital, loses her baby 2 weeks later. This is another thing that kind of gets glossed over or forgotten, the fact that she's having miscarriages as well, just to add to this trauma in their lives. And there's a thing that I actually find really moving, which is where they take the final heartbeats of I think they called him John Ono Lennon II, the unborn baby. You could say, they're using that as an album, but that's the whole point. They're not using it on a commercial album as some gimmick. The whole point is that they are documenting their lives.
Yes.
And it's quite hard to listen to, because again, you're talking about, you're going right back to the innocence of an unborn child who's been lost, and that child will never grow up and will never know what it might have become. I'm a bit biased because I've got a soft spot for conceptual art and performance art and that kind of thing. Don't like all of it, but it's about ideas really rather than execution, Have you got any opinions on John and Yoko's films? Some of which were made in 68, some were 69.
I find them interesting. I wish that they would have done more film together like that than maybe music.
Right. Yes.
In my opinion, the films have a little bit more, they're just a little deeper. I think there's a little more there. And the conceptual part of it, I think, always really is aided with a visual, which film gives you, and their music does not. So I think that's one of the better things Yoko introduced him to. It's not for the mainstream, obviously, but there's a lot of that going on. A lot of people were doing that kind of thing, and they just were the most high-profile people doing it. So that's why we were talking about it all these years later.
Yeah, sure. There was one called Rape. I have a feeling that wasn't 68, but anyway. And it was a camera crew following a woman around. But the interesting thing is they hadn't told the woman what they were doing. So, in fact, just by making the film, they were invading her privacy, making the film to make the point about people's privacy being invaded. There's lots of levels to this, It's interesting. November the 3rd, All My Loving by Tony Palmer, which is quite an interesting film, which has almost everyone you've ever heard of that are 60s heroes. Have you seen that one, All My Loving?
I've not seen that, no.
Try and seek that out, you and the listeners. Paul appears on it. It's the one where he's talking about classical music. He says pop music is the classical music of today. Ringo's interviewed, George Martin's interviewed. Tony Palmer went on to make a series called All You Need Is Love, which was about 10 parts, which again you could probably find online somewhere. He was a good filmmaker. November the 8th, John and Cynthia's marriage is dissolved in 8 minutes. That's how long it takes, or how short it takes. Two Virgins is released on the 11th. All I'm going to say about the album cover that we all know about is that I had an idea to make a jigsaw puzzle of the Two Virgins album cover. How about that? Not bad, eh? I'm still waiting for it to arrive in the post. That'll be an entertaining evening, wouldn't it? No comment. Yoko miscarries her baby, as we said, and then November the 25th, again, this date is not clear. I sent you a clip earlier, what they call the dentist interview. These interviews have names, like you got the Two Junkies one. They were in Knightsbridge, and they did an interview for a Dutch sociologist. And I've just put in my notes, John Lennon looks higher than I've ever seen him, and more vacant and more thin and pale, and he looks terrible.
Yeah, this is the time when Lennon starts looking shabby. You know, one of the problems of the 60s and the hippie movement, particularly starting in the second half of 68 and into 69, is everybody got uglier. You know, they looked more unkempt. I mean, because if you look at the 66, 67, early 68 era, you've got all these, fashion, the flowery clothes, it was expensive stuff, really creative stuff, leathers and suedes and feather boas and all this. Well, by this time, in this particular interview, Lennon looks like he hasn't bathed in a couple of days. He looks thin, he looks gaunt. The quality of the film isn't the best. And this is the image he was portraying in late 68. And at this point, he was always with Yoko Ono. She actually never looked that disheveled. They were obviously dressing alike. But she typically looked like she washed her hair and things. She didn't look like she stopped taking care of herself. Although some people, there's reports otherwise. But as far as when she stepped out publicly, she seemed to have it together. Lennon, not always.
Yeah, there's reports of Montague Square, that it just became a total tip. And this is what I would think of as two creative people who are doing heroin. There's books lying around and bits of paper lying around and drawings lying around and newspapers, because they were both well into sort of newspapers, and John Lennon was a media junkie as well. Dan Richter, who's been on the show a couple of times, he said that in general, Yoko was more of a kind of coffee and cigarettes person. She didn't smoke loads of weed. John would have a joint going just because he probably had too much going on in his head and wanted to kind of chill it down a little bit. That was the impression I got from Dan Richter. But in this interview, this dentist interview, the thing that comes across, his voice is very, very hoarse. And through the whole interview, there's no animation at all. I was saying to you earlier, have you ever seen a John Lennon interview where he doesn't at least sort of wisecrack or smile or crack a few jokes? He's just got this sort of very vacant, so it looks very thin and very pale. But as you were saying earlier, the drugs were getting heavier and the whole scene was getting heavier, basically. It was losing its innocence, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
If this dentist interview is November the 25th, then I'm not 100% sure. November the 28th, John and Yoko appear at Marylebone Magistrates Court. John pleads guilty to possession of cannabis resin, is fined £150 plus 20 guineas costs. He famously pleads guilty so Yoko won't get deported. But then, true to form, having looked like a complete mess, John magically gets it together a couple of weeks later for the Rock and Roll Circus, which actually didn't get released until the mid-90s. What's your opinion of the Rock and Roll Circus as a film?
I don't like it much. It's a period piece. Obviously, Michael Lindsay Hogg. I like seeing the Stones at that time and Marianne Faithfull. Obviously, they had a new band, Jethro Tull on. Tony Iommi is playing guitar in that as well.
That's right, yeah.
He was only 2 weeks in the band, I think, and then left. So it's an interesting curio with the Who and everything, and they got these goofy costumes. So there's a little bit of a leftover from the psychedelic period with all these wizard things that they're wearing or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a little bit goofy, but I think it's still interesting. We don't have a lot of the Stones weren't performing, so the Stones really needed to make an appearance of some kind, I think, because Jones was still with them at the time. They weren't really touring with him. They weren't able to for a lot of reasons, but it seemed like John Lennon, why he said yes to that, I'm not sure. I suppose an opportunity for him and Yoko to do something.
Yeah, I did discover that George was apparently supposed to play guitar.
Oh, really?
So George was going to be on it as well, which would have been interesting. So you had half the Beatles there. But I think you're right, it's a period piece. It's so late 60s, because there's a lot of casualties or near casualties. There was a great clip online that's disappeared of Pete Townsend talking about it, and he actually had a really good chat with Yoko because they had a few mutual interests. Maybe it was even Mayor Barber, where you get Baba O'Reilly, but would have been some people to do with conceptual art. Pete Townsend said Keith looked basically green, literally, and Brian Jones, he said, was just out to lunch. But there's a difference, you see. Keith performs pretty well. I mean, he enjoys doing Yer Blues. I've always loved Yer Blues as a song. I think that's one of John Lennon's best because it's so raw. And they do a great performance, and I'm a big fan of Mitch Mitchell. I prefer Mitch Mitchell to Ginger Baker. If we're talking jazzy rock drummers from the 60s, yeah. Maybe it's because I like Hendrix more than the Cream. Maybe that's I'm biased. I just prefer those records.
Another fan of Yoko Ono was Marianne Faithfull. She got on really well with Yoko Ono.
Right.
And they got to spend some time together. Now, one other thing I'd like to point out, I mean, just the absolute either poor planning or not caring. This program was recorded, and it went way into the early hours of the morning. It just like, how can you expect anybody, you know, I mean, they were always doing uppers and downers. They were always using these drugs to work or to not work. And that's what got Brian Epstein in trouble. He died. And that was just normal for these musicians, but there's a limit. And I think that's partly why this thing wasn't shown, because they were, by the time they got this thing shot, I don't know how early in the morning it was, but everybody's all burnt out.
3 or 4 in the morning, perhaps?
Was it?
Something like that.
I mean, it's just poor planning. It just seemed to be that was the norm in the 60s. Whatever goes, and, you know, if we're tired, we'll just take some uppers.
Yeah, well, I think Pete Townsend, what he said in this interview was that Mick was very good. I mean, Mick was doing drugs, obviously, but he always had that practicality. He was the one who was arranging them. But Pete Townsend said Mick had a really hard job because, like I was saying earlier, he had Keith Richards on one side, pretty out of it, but able to perform, and then Brian Jones on the other. And then obviously Bill and Charlie, I guess, weren't doing drugs.
Yeah, Mick Jagger, he abstained quite a bit. He was not a big drug taker throughout the 60s at all. And if you read Marianne Faithfull's book, she goes into that, because she got deep into it, obviously. It was his personality to always kind of stay sober. It had to do with his image. He didn't want to make a fool of himself as well.
I'm glad it's out there, though, Rock and Roll Circus, because I do quite enjoy it. I like Salt of the Earth, the last song. It's sort of tribute to the working class. I like that, where you get all of them clapping along, singing along. Again, you know, it's kind of Hey Jude-esque, but this time it's not members of the public. It's the rock and roll fraternity, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just saw in my notes, George was scheduled to appear but had to do urgent remixing of the Jackie Lomax album. That's why he wasn't there. John and Yoko appear as Father and Mother Christmas at the Apple Christmas party. And just as they say, you know, with a boxer, the last thing to go is their punch. I think the last thing to go with John Lennon is his sense of humour and irony. I mean, John Lennon must have realised what trauma he'd been going through this year and what he was still going through. But that's the thing. That's what I like about John and Yoko. They can be ironic and they can laugh and say, let's dress up as Father and Mother Christmas and go ho, ho, ho and hand out presents. That's John Lennon. And finally, the 6th Christmas record is sent to fans. Now, the point has been made, if you listen to those Christmas records back to back, that is the Beatles' career in terms of unity. You know, 63, very much on script. 64, 65 gets a bit looser. 66, 67, they come up with a little sort of mini play almost. 68, they're more disjointed, and then 69, they're completely disjointed. Produced by Kenny Everett. So, we've reached the end. We've racked up nearly 4 hours here. It's not bad.
Well, 2 parts, right?
2 parts, yeah.
Yeah, well, it took quite a lot to get through, and it was an important year.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm so pleased we did this year. I mean, 67 would have been great, and we may do that in the future. But this year, doing the planning for it, doing the research, obviously I knew a fair amount of it already, but researching the world and then the Beatles universe, they're both very intense, you know. I'm going to give you the last word. What would you like to say about 1968?
Well, I guess like I've always said, it's an important year for me personally. I was born in that year, and being born in the year of revolt, which followed the Summer of Love, things started to get hairy, and it seemed to all culminate the end of the 60s with the end of the Beatles, and it was something that the fans didn't expect and took pretty hard. And I think some people took the end of the 60s hard as well.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to the listeners that I did this the wrong way round. I just did 69 a few months ago, and now we're doing 68. Perhaps just say to the listeners, if you haven't heard the 69 episode, why don't you listen to this one and then that one afterwards? Have some kind of a logical chronology. So let me ask you about Pop Goes the 60s. How far do you plan in advance? And have you got anything you could tell us about?
Well, I plan in advance. So I'm only been at this 2.5 years, and I started really putting down a schedule for the whole year. So what I've got a bunch of things that I'm just kind of move around. So the only thing I try to do is, since I did all that Get Back stuff, I pulled away from the Beatles a little bit, just did a long series on the Byrds. I'm doing a couple interviews. I've got a review of Ian McDonald's Revolution in the Head coming out very soon. I've got a 3-part series on why the Beatles broke up coming out, so we're going to get back into the Beatles. I've got a stack of bands to do that'll take me well into the next decade. And I'm trying to also, I want to encourage more people to take part in the discussion. I'm going to be adding another level, I guess another subscription level for people that will allow people to get more involved in some of the surveys I'm going to be doing and deciding what I'm going to be working on. I need to get feedback from them to understand what people's feelings are out there. For instance, like the 10 reasons the Beatles broke up. We're going to rank these and try to put some clarity around it and things like that. So I'm looking really forward to it.
Excellent. And by the time this goes out, your talk with John Stewart may have already been out. Author of John Lennon, Marx and God, former guest of this show.
Yes, he and I will be getting together very soon.
He's a very nice guy. You'll have a great time.
All right, thank you.
And I think that's about it, really. There's more we could say, of course. We only did 5 minutes on the White Album. We could have done 4 hours on that. But anyway, yeah, just to say thanks a lot for doing this. And
it was good time. I enjoyed, I like talking about the greater vision of the entire time period and putting things in perspective from a wider view is really, really helpful.
We could go forward in the future. There's a couple of years left, 71, 73, 74, so we might do one of those in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing I could offer, I at least was around in those years. I can remember, so there's a feel that goes along with some of it. It's particularly in America. For me, it was just a golden time for me, idyllic time I grew up in, so that's how I view it.
All right. And then for listeners to Film Gold, I think we're going to do The Killing, the Stanley Kubrick film at some point. I think we said that.
That'll be
great.
great.
If you haven't heard Rear Window, everybody, that's on Film Gold, one of the last episodes. All right, so thank you to you, and thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.